After Virtue underscore a study in moral theory, T. Alastair MacIntyre. Alastair MacIntyre's After Virtue, 1981, argues that modern moral discourse is in a state of disorder because the Enlightenment project of justifying morality by reason alone was bound to fail, leaving us with fragments of older moral traditions stripped of their context. MacIntyre traces the virtues from heroic societies through Athens, Aristotle, and the Middle Ages, then proposes that the Aristotelian tradition, reconstituted within a narrative understanding of human life and community, offers the only viable alternative to emotivism and Nietzschean individualism. Abstract. Alastair MacIntyre's After Virtue, 1981, is a sustained historical and philosophical argument that modern moral discourse is in a state of disorder because the Enlightenment project of justifying morality by reason alone was bound to fail. Through the famous thought experiment of a catastrophe in the natural sciences, MacIntyre demonstrates that we possess the words of morality but have lost the context that once gave them meaning, a condition traceable to the Enlightenment's attempt to ground morality in pure reason, which failed when Hume, Kant, and Kierkegaard each relied on the failure of the others. The book traces the virtues from heroic societies through Athens, Aristotle, and the Middle Ages, showing how each stage contributed distinct insights. Narrative form, the Aristotelian account of eudaimonia, the weakening of the strong unity of virtues, while also introducing tensions that modernity would exploit. MacIntyre then reconstructs the positive alternative. The virtues are those qualities that sustain practices, the narrative unity of human life, and the traditions within which both are embedded. Justice, in this account, is a virtue rather than a distributive principle, a fact that reveals the incommensurability of modern rival theories of justice. The book concludes with a stark choice between Nietzsche and Aristotle, and a call to construct local forms of community within which the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. Executive summary. Central thesis. The book's core argument is that the language of morality in advanced modernity is in a state of grave disorder. We possess fragments of conceptual scheme, the words duty, justice, virtue, but the context that once gave them meaning have been lost. This disorder has a specific historical origin. The Enlightenment project of providing a rational, secular foundation for morality was bound to fail, because the three great rivals, Hume, Kant, Kierkegaard, each relied on the failure of the others, and their collective failure left morality without any public shared rationale. The only viable alternative to this disorder is the recovery of the Aristotelian tradition. The account of the virtues as qualities that enable a person to achieve the good life within a community and a tradition, and the conception of human life as a narrative pursuit of the good. Foundational observations. The disquieting suggestion. The language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in an imaginary world where science has been destroyed and its fragments reassembled without their original context. We possess simulacra of morality, but have lost comprehension of it. Emotivism as social diagnosis. Emotivism, the doctrine that all moral judgments are expressions of preference, is not a philosophical error to be refuted, but a social reality to be described. What emotivists describe with philosophical imprecision is the actual state of moral discourse in a culture that has lost its shared moral framework. The masquerade of rationality, emotivists providing philosophical reasons for emotivism, is itself a symptom of the disorder. The Enlightenment project's failure. The Enlightenment's attempt to provide a rational, secular foundation for morality failed because Hume, Kant, and Kierkegaard each relied on the failure of the others. Hume grounded morality in passion, but invoked a fiction of universal sympathy. Kant grounded it in pure reason, but detached the self from its social context. Kierkegaard grounded it in criterionless choice. The result was that morality was left without any public, shared rationale or justification, and its consequences, bureaucratic individualism and the emotivist self, were devastating. The classical tradition as alternative. The virtues understood within the classical tradition, from Homer through Aristotle and the Middle Ages, are those qualities that sustain practices, the narrative unity of a human life, and the traditions within which both are embedded. Heroic societies understood the virtues as qualities that sustain the social roles through which the individual's life is narrated. Athens introduced the tension between role-based and individual virtue. Aristotle grounded the virtues in eudaimonia and practical reasoning. The Middle Ages weakened but preserved the tradition. Practices, traditions, and narrative selfhood. A practice is any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form are realized. Traditions are not static, but historically extended, socially embodied arguments about the goods that constitute them. The self is not a detachable individual, but a narrative unity. Man is in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. Justice, incommensurability, and the new dark ages. Modern rival conceptions of justice, Rawls's equality of need versus Nozick's entitlement, are rationally incommensurable, a symptom of the disorder, not a defect of the arguments. The concept of desert, which belongs to the classical tradition, persists as a living residue. Modern politics, lacking genuine moral consensus, is civil war carried on by other means. The only adequate response is the Benedictine model, the construction of local forms of community within which the moral life can be sustained. Significance and recommendation. After Virtue is one of the most influential works of moral philosophy of the 20th century. Its central argument, that modern moral discourse is in disorder because of the failure of the Enlightenment project, has shaped debates in ethics, political philosophy, and cultural criticism for decades. MacIntyre's recovery of the Aristotelian tradition and his insistence on the narrative character of human life have been taken up by communitarians, virtue ethicists, and theological philosophers. The book's analysis of the incommensurability of modern rival theories of justice, its account of practices and traditions, and its diagnosis of modern politics as civil war carried on by other means remain essential reference points. The Benedictine option, the construction of local communities that sustain the moral life, has become one of the most consequential proposals in contemporary social thought. The book is essential reading for anyone interested in the foundations of morality, the history of philosophy, and the relationship between tradition and modernity. Prologue. After Virtue, after a quarter of a century. MacIntyre opens the third edition prologue with the calm defiance of a philosopher who has spent a quarter century defending a thesis he considers still unrefuted. If there are good reasons to reject the central theses of After Virtue, by now I should certainly have learned what they are. He writes, a sentence that functions simultaneously as self-assessment and challenge. The prologue surveys the reception history across English, Danish, Polish, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Italian, Turkish, Chinese, and Japanese, and acknowledges that while he has supplemented and revised his arguments in subsequent works, whose justice? Which rationality? 1988. Three rival versions of moral inquiry, 1990. Dependent rational animals, 1999. The major contentions remain intact. The prologue records a significant intellectual development. MacIntyre came to recognize, through his engagement with Aquinas, that his attempt to provide an account of the human good purely in social terms, in terms of practices, traditions, and the narrative unity of human lives, was bound to be inadequate without a metaphysical grounding. It is only because human beings have an end towards which they are directed by reason of their specific nature that practices, traditions, and the like are able to function as they do. The MacIntyre of 1999 was more explicitly Thomistic than the MacIntyre of 1981, not because he had abandoned the earlier project, but because he had discovered that the social historical account already presupposed the metaphysical structure it had failed to articulate. He became a Thomist in part because he became convinced that Aquinas was in some respects a better Aristotelian than Aristotle. Not only an excellent interpreter of Aristotle's texts, but someone who had been able to extend and deepen both Aristotle's metaphysical and his moral inquiries. The prologue also addresses the charge of relativism, an accusation that MacIntyre finds puzzling but persistent. He explains that the Aristotelian and Thomistic tradition of the virtues is, like some but not all other moral traditions, a tradition of inquiry. It is characteristic of traditions of inquiry that they claim truth for their central theses and soundness for their central arguments. A tradition can defeat a rival not by appeal to neutral standards. There are none, but by demonstrating that it is only from its own standpoint that the difficulties of the rival tradition can be adequately understood and overcome. The defeated tradition may not recognize that such a defeat has occurred. The protagonists may continue to defend their positions indefinitely, unable to recognize that those inquiries are in fact condemned to sterility and frustration. What he came to see in dependent rational animals is that this anti-relativist defense of tradition itself presupposes a metaphysical biology. Human beings are dependent rational animals directed toward an end by their specific nature, and without that teleological frame, the social account of practices and traditions cannot stand on its own. The Thomistic turn, MacIntyre's post, 1981 turn to Aquinas, was not an abandonment of Aristotle, but a deepening. He recognized that Aristotle's metaphysical biology was wrong, but that the teleological framework it embodied could be sustained on Thomistic grounds. Traditions of inquiry. A moral tradition is not a static body of doctrine, but an ongoing argument about the goods that constitute it. Rival traditions can defeat one another without neutral standards by demonstrating the inadequacy of their rivals' resources. The anti-nostalgia thesis. MacIntyre insists that his account of the virtues is not a nostalgic longing for the past, but a modern understanding, available only retrospectively from the standpoint of modernity. Quote, "It is only because human beings have an end towards which they are directed by reason of their specific nature that practices, traditions, and the like are able to function as they do." Prologue, quote, "What I now understand much better than I did 25 years ago is the nature of the relevant Aristotelian commitments." Prologue, a disquieting suggestion. Chapter 1 is the famous thought experiment that frames the entire book. MacIntyre invites the reader to imagine a catastrophe in which the natural sciences are destroyed, laboratories burned, physicists lynched, books and instruments destroyed, science teaching abolished. Later, a reaction sets in and enlightened people seek to revive science, but all they possess are fragments, a knowledge of experiments detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance. Parts of theories unrelated either to the other bits and pieces of theory which they possess or to experiment. Instruments whose use has been forgotten, half chapters from books, single pages from articles, not always fully legible because torn and charred. Adults argue about the respective merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory, possessing only a partial knowledge of each. Children memorize portions of the periodic table and recite theorems of Euclid as incantations. Nobody realizes that what they're doing is not natural science in any proper sense, for everything conforms to certain canons of consistency and coherence. Yet those contexts which would make sense of what they're doing have been lost. The imaginary world is populated by pseudoscientists and real philosophers. Analytical philosophy would flourish in such a world, but would never reveal the disorder, because its techniques are essentially descriptive of the present language. Phenomenology and existentialism would be equally blind. The inhabitants would use expressions like neutrino, mass, and atomic weight in systematic ways that resembled earlier usage, but many of the presupposed beliefs would have been lost, and an element of arbitrariness would appear in their application. Rival and competing premises, for which no further argument could be given, would abound. Subjectivist theories of science would emerge and be criticized by those who held that the notion of truth embodied in what they took to be science was incompatible with subjectivism. Then comes the devastating application. The hypothesis which I wish to advance is that in the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I described. The inhabitants of the imaginary world no longer realize the nature of the catastrophe they have suffered. Yet surely an event of such striking world historical dimensions could not have been lost from view. MacIntyre's answer is that academic history, which is less than 2 centuries old, would itself be a product of the disorder. Suppose that the catastrophe of which my hypothesis speaks had occurred before, or largely before, the founding of academic history, so that the moral and other evaluative presuppositions of academic history derived from the forms of the disorder which it brought about. If this is so, the standpoint of academic history is such that from its value-neutral viewpoint moral disorder must remain largely invisible. All that the historian will be allowed to perceive by the canons and categories of his discipline will be one morality succeeding another. 17th century Puritanism, 18th century hedonism, the Victorian work ethic, and so on, but the very language of order and disorder will not be available to him. This means that the forms of the academic curriculum would turn out to be among the symptoms of the disaster, whose occurrence the curriculum does not acknowledge. And the modern radical is no better positioned than the conservative. Whatever else he denounces in our culture, he is certain that it still possesses the moral resources which he requires in order to denounce it. Everything else may be, in his eyes, in disorder, but the language of morality is in order, just as it is. That he too may be being betrayed by the very language he uses is not a thought available to him. It is the aim of the entire book to make that thought available. The power of this opening lies in its defamiliarization. MacIntyre does not argue that modern moral discourse is confused. That would be banal. He argues that the confusion has a specific historical origin, a catastrophe, a period of disorder, and a restoration in which the fragments were reassembled without their original context. The history of moral philosophy from the Enlightenment onward is the history of this disordered discourse. And the task of the book is to reconstruct that history, identify the catastrophe, and determine whether the Aristotelian tradition that preceded it can be recovered. The thought experiment, the science catastrophe, analogy is designed to make the disorder of moral discourse visible by analogy to a disorder in a domain, natural science, where the reader assumes coherence and order. Invisible disorder. Academic philosophy, history, and sociology are all structurally incapable of detecting the disorder because their own evaluative presuppositions derive from the disordered forms they purport to study. The radical's blindness. Even modern radicals, who denounce everything else in the culture, assume that the language of morality is in order, that they can still draw on moral resources to make their denunciations. Quote, "What we possess, if this view is true, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess indeed simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions. But we have, very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality." Quote, "All that the historian will be allowed to perceive by the canons and categories of his discipline will be one morality succeeding another. 17th century Puritanism, 18th century hedonism, the Victorian work ethic, and so on, but the very language of order and disorder will not be available to him." Quote, "That he too may be being betrayed by the very language he uses is not a thought available to him. It is the aim of this book to make that thought available to liberals and radicals, conservatives alike." The nature of moral disagreement today and the claims of emotivism. Chapters 2 and 3 form the empirical core of MacIntyre's diagnosis, the evidence on which the entire historical and philosophical argument depends. Chapter 2 opens with a description so precise it reads like a field report from the culture wars. The most striking feature of contemporary moral utterance is that so much of it is used to express disagreements. And the most striking feature of the debates in which these disagreements are expressed is their interminable character. MacIntyre does not mean merely that moral debates go on indefinitely, though they do, but that they apparently can find no terminus. There seems to be no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture. To demonstrate this, MacIntyre constructs 3 extended arguments: unjust war, abortion, and the relationship between justice and liberty, each presented in 3 incompatible but internally valid versions. The just war debate pits the pacifist. No modern war can meet the criteria against the deterrent advocate. If you wish for peace, prepare for war. And the liberation theorist, wars to liberate oppressed groups are justified. The abortion debate pits rights-based permissiveness against universalizability and the sanctity of life. The justice debate pits equality against liberty. Each argument is logically valid. The conclusions follow from the premises. But the rival premises employ quite different normative concepts: justice against survival, rights against universalizability, equality against liberty, and we possess no rational way of weighing the claims of one as against another. What makes these examples so effective is that they are not philosophers' constructions, but real debates, appearing in newspaper editorials and high school debates, on radio talk shows and letters to congressmen, in bars, barracks, and boardrooms. Their typicality, the fact that they are what people actually say when they argue about morality, is what makes them important. Herman Kahn and the Pope, Che Guevara and Milton Friedman have produced variant versions of these arguments, but it is their appearance in everyday discourse, not in expert treatises, that establishes their diagnostic force. The shrink-wrapping of philosophical abstraction into lived argument is itself a symptom. These are the fragments of different moral vocabularies, each carrying the echo of a context in which it once made sense, now deployed in a context where no shared framework can adjudicate between them. MacIntyre identifies three salient characteristics of these debates. The first is what he calls their conceptual incommensurability. Every premise employs a different normative or evaluative concept from the others, so that when we argue back to our premises, argument ceases and the invocation of one premise against another becomes a matter of pure assertion and counter-assertion. This is why so much moral debate carries a slightly shrill tone. The shrillness of people who sense that they lack the rational resources to settle the matter and are therefore reduced to will. But that shrillness has an additional source. It is not only in arguments with others that we are reduced so quickly to assertion and counter-assertion. It is also in the arguments that we have within ourselves. For whenever an agent enters the forum of public debate, he has already, explicitly or implicitly, settled the matter in his own mind. Yet if we possess no unassailable criteria by which we may convince our opponents, it follows that in making up our own minds we can have made no appeal to such criteria either. If I lack good reasons to invoke against you, it must seem that I lack good reasons. Hence, underlying my own position, there must appear to be some non-rational decision to adopt that position. Corresponding to the interminability of public argument, there is at least the appearance of a disquieting private arbitrariness. The second characteristic is paradoxical. Despite the interminability, contemporary moral arguments all purport to be impersonal rational arguments and are usually presented in a mode appropriate to that impersonality. When I say do so, and you ask, why? I can answer because I wish it, but that gives you no reason to comply unless you happen to want what I want, or unless some personal relationship, superior officer, lover, creditor, gives my wish independent weight. Or I can answer because it is your duty, and here the appeal is to impersonal criteria that exist independently of who utters them or whether they are uttered at all. The particular link between context of utterance and reason-giving force that always holds for expressions of personal preference is severed in the case of moral and other evaluative utterances. The peculiar feature of contemporary moral discourse is that it simultaneously and inconsistently treats moral argument as an exercise of rational powers and as mere expressive assertion. If we attended solely to the first characteristic, we might conclude that contemporary disagreements are nothing but a clash of antagonistic wills. But the second characteristic, the use of expressions whose distinctive function is to embody what purports to be an appeal to objective standards, suggests otherwise. The question, why this masquerade, is one MacIntyre will answer historically. The practice of moral argument in our culture expresses at least an aspiration to be or to become rational in this area of our lives, even when the aspiration cannot be fulfilled. The third characteristic is that the rival premises have wide and heterogeneous historical origins. The concept of justice in the first argument has its roots in Aristotle. The concept of success and survival traces through Bismarck and Clausewitz to Machiavelli. Liberation theory owes debts to Marx and Fichte. In the second debate, Lockean rights compete with Kantian universalizability and Thomas natural law. In the third, T.H. Green and Rousseau compete with Adam Smith. This catalog of great names is suggestive but may mislead in two ways. It may lead us to underestimate the complexity of the history, and it may lead us to look for that history only in the writings of philosophers rather than in the intricate bodies of theory and practice which constitute human cultures. The surface rhetoric of our culture speaks complacently of moral pluralism, but pluralism may equally well apply to an ordered dialogue of intersecting viewpoints and to an unharmonious melange of ill-assorted fragments. The suspicion, for the moment, it can only be a suspicion, that it is the latter with which we have to deal is heightened when we recognize that all those various concepts were originally at home in larger totalities of theory and practice, in which they enjoyed a role and function supplied by contexts of which they have now been deprived. Moreover, the concepts we employ have, in at least some cases, changed their character in the past 300 years. In the transition from the variety of contexts in which they were originally at home to our own contemporary culture, virtue and justice and piety and duty and even ought have become other than they once were. One obstacle to constructing the historical narrative that would explain these changes has been the persistently unhistorical treatment of moral philosophy. We still too often treat the moral philosophers of the past as contributors to a single debate with a relatively unvarying subject matter, treating Plato and Hume and Mill as contemporaries both of ourselves and of each other. Kant ceases to be part of the history of Prussia. Hume is no longer a Scotsman. Empirical history is one thing, philosophy quite another, or so the academic curriculum assumes. Yet there seems to be a possible relationship between the history of moral discourse and the history of the academic curriculum itself. At this point, the emotivist challenge must be confronted directly. Contemporary moral argument is rationally interminable, it will be said, because all moral, indeed all evaluative, argument is and always must be rationally interminable. What MacIntyre presents as a contingent feature of our culture, standing in need of historical explanation, is a necessary feature of all cultures which possess evaluative discourse. Emotivism is the doctrine invited by this challenge. All evaluative judgments are nothing but expressions of preference, attitude, or feeling. Agreement in moral judgment is not to be secured by any rational method, for there are none. It is to be secured, if at all, by producing certain non-rational effects on the emotions or attitudes of those who disagree. If emotivism is true, the features of contemporary moral debate have nothing to do with what is specifically contemporary, and MacIntyre's entire historical thesis collapses before it has properly begun. The rest of Chapter 2 and all of Chapter 3 are devoted to showing why emotivism, though it cannot be refuted as a timeless theory of meaning, must be reinterpreted as a theory of use, and why. So reinterpreted, it confirms rather than destroys MacIntyre's diagnosis. Conceptual incommensurability. The rival premises of moral debates are not merely different, but incommensurable. They employ different normative concepts that cannot be rationally weighed against each other. The masquerade of rationality. Contemporary moral discourse simultaneously treats moral arguments as rational appeals to impersonal standards and as expressions of personal preference, a contradiction that is itself a symptom of disorder. Fragmented inheritance. The moral vocabulary of modernity is composed of fragments borrowed from different traditions: Aristotle, Machiavelli, Marx, Kant, Thomism, each of which originally belonged to a larger total theory and practice from which it has been torn. Quote, every one of the arguments is logically valid or can be easily expanded, so as to be made so. The conclusions do indeed follow from the premises. But the rival premises are such that we possess no rational way of weighing the claims of one as against another. Quote, we use moral judgments not only to express our own feelings and attitudes, but also precisely to produce such effects in others. Ch2 on emotivism. Quote, what would appear to be rival and competing premises for which no further argument could be given would abound. Subjectivist theories of science would appear and would be criticized by those who held that the notion of truth embodied in what they took to be science was incompatible with subjectivism. Ch1, echoing into Ch2. Emotivism, social content and social context. Chapter 3 introduces emotivism, the doctrine that all evaluative judgments are nothing but expressions of preference, attitude, or feeling, and then performs the remarkable move of treating it not as a philosophical error to be refuted, but as a social reality to be described. Stevenson defined emotivism as a theory of meaning. This is good means roughly, I approve of this, do so as well. But as a theory of meaning, emotivism plainly fails. When asked what kind of feelings or attitudes moral judgments express, emotivists reply feelings of approval. And when asked what kind of approval, they can only answer moral approval, which is vacuously circular. Moreover, emotivism tries to make equivalent in meaning two kinds of expression that derive their distinctive function precisely from the contrast between them. Expressions of personal preference, whose reason-giving force depends on who utters them to whom, and evaluative expressions, which appeal to impersonal criteria independent of context. The angry schoolmaster who shouts 7 times 7 equals 49 at a pupil venting his feelings uses a sentence whose expressive function has nothing to do with its meaning. This suggests that emotivism ought to have been proposed as a theory about the use, purpose, or function of moral expressions rather than about their meaning. Even if the meaning of moral sentences is quite other than emotivists supposed, it might still be claimed that in using them agents are doing nothing other than expressing feelings and attempting to influence the feelings of others. If so, meaning in use would be radically discrepant. Meaning would tend to conceal use. We could not safely infer what someone who uttered a moral judgment was doing merely by listening to what he said, and the agent himself might be among those for whom use was concealed by meaning, assured that he was appealing to independent impersonal criteria when all he was doing was expressing his feelings in a manipulative way. How might such a phenomenon come to occur? The answer lies in historically specific conditions. Emotivism flourished in this century as a response to theories which flourished especially in England between 1903 and 1939. Above all, G. Moore's intuitionism. Moore proclaimed in Principia Ethica that good is the name of a simple, indefinable, non-natural property, that right action is that which produces the most good, and that personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments constitute the greatest goods. Keynes described the book as the beginning of a renaissance, the opening of a new heaven on a new earth. Yet Moore's 3 central positions are logically independent of each other, and the first is plainly false. Why did highly intelligent people accept this naive apocalypticism? Because the group who were to become Bloomsbury had already accepted the values of Moore's 6th chapter, friendship and aesthetic enjoyment, but could not accept these as merely personal preferences. They needed objective and impersonal justification for rejecting all claims except those of personal intercourse and the beautiful. What they were rejecting was not Plato or St. Paul, but the moral culture of the late 19th century. Sidgwick, Leslie Stephen, Spencer, Bradley. What was left was a highly impoverished view of how good may be used. Among Moore's followers, the central topics of discussion were whether A's love for B, under a misapprehension, was better or worse than A's not being in love at all, and how such questions were to be answered by discerning the presence or absence of the non-natural property of good. But what was really happening was something quite other. In practice, victory was with those who could speak with the greatest appearance of clear, undoubting conviction and could best use the accents of infallibility. Keynes's retrospective confession, describing Moore's gasps of incredulity, Strachey's grim silences, and Lowe's Dickinson shrugs. There is evident here precisely that gap between the meaning and purport of what was being said and the use to which utterance was being put, to which the reinterpretation of emotivism drew attention. MacIntyre argues that the most sophisticated emotivists, F. B. Ramsey, Austin Duncan Jones, C. L. Stevenson, were all pupils of More, and it is not implausible to suppose that they did in fact confuse moral utterance at Cambridge and in other places with a similar inheritance after 1903 with moral utterance as such, and that they therefore presented what was in essentials a correct account of the former, as though it were an account of the latter. This is the crucial reversal. Emotivism is not a timeless philosophical truth about the meaning of moral language, but an empirical thesis about the state of a particular culture at a particular time. There is an Oxford history beginning from Pritchard's intuitionism to parallel More's Cambridge history. Wherever something like emotivism flourishes, it generally succeeds views analogous to More's or Pritchard's. The scheme of moral decline, these remarks presuppose, has three stages. A first at which moral theory and practice embody genuine objective standards susceptible of rational justification. A second at which there are unsuccessful attempts to maintain objectivity while the project of rational justification continuously breaks down. And a third at which emotivist theories secure wide implicit acceptance because of a general implicit recognition that claims to objectivity cannot be made good. Emotivism, reinterpreted as a theory of use, is connected with this third stage. Our own culture entered it early in the present century. Yet emotivism did not prevail within analytical moral philosophy, which defined its central task as deciphering meaning. Since emotivism fails as a theory of meaning, analytical philosophers largely rejected it. But emotivism did not die. Here's an account of moral reasoning, according to which every chain of justificatory reasoning must terminate with the assertion of some rule or principle for which no further reason can be given. If the inquirer still goes on asking, "But why should I live like that?" then there is no further answer to give him. Leaves emotivism not very far behind. Nietzsche and Sartre, in very different vocabularies, concede the substance of emotivism in the negative parts of their critiques. Nietzsche indicts objective moral judgment as the mask of the will to power. Sartre exhibits bourgeois morality as bad faith. Both are philosophically most powerful in negation. The Übermensch and the Sartrean existentialist Marxist belong in a philosophical bestiary. The appearance of emotivism in this variety of philosophical guises suggests that MacIntyre's thesis must be defined in terms of confrontation with emotivism. For one way of framing the contention that morality is not what it once was is just to say that to a large degree people now think, talk, and act as if emotivism were true, no matter what their avowed theoretical standpoint may be. Emotivism has become embodied in our culture. But of course, in saying this, MacIntyre is not merely contending that morality is not what it once was, but also that what once was morality has to some large degree disappeared, and that this marks a degeneration, a grave cultural loss. The self that emerges from emotivism is deprived, stripped of the social identity and the telos that once gave moral discourse its point. In many pre-modern societies, individuals identify themselves through membership in social groups. I am brother, cousin, and grandson, member of this household, that village, this tribe. These are not characteristics that belong to human beings accidentally, to be stripped away in order to discover the real me. They are part of my substance, defining partially at least, and sometimes wholly my obligations and my duties. The emotivist self, by contrast, has no necessary social identity and no rational history of transitions from one moral commitment to another. Inner conflicts are for it necessarily the confrontation of one contingent arbitrariness by another. The connection between emotivism as a philosophical thesis and emotivism as a social diagnosis is the chapter's most devastating move. If moral utterances function in our culture in ways that make them better described by emotivism than by any rationalist account, then the emotivist challenge cannot be met by philosophical argument alone. It requires a historical explanation of how we got into this state. Emotivism as social diagnosis. Emotivism is not a timeless philosophical truth, but an empirical description of the state of a particular culture. A culture in which the context that once gave moral language its meaning have been lost. The deprived self. The emotivist self has no necessary social identity and no rational history of transitions from one moral commitment to another. It is a self whose substance has been stripped away. The Moore-Cambridge connection, the emotivists were describing, with philosophical imprecision, the actual state of moral discourse among Moore's followers, a state in which people believed they were identifying objective properties but were actually expressing preferences. Quote, "In practice, victory was with those who could speak with the greatest appearance of clear, undoubting conviction and could best use the accents of infallibility." Ch2, Keynes on Moore's followers. Quote, "I am brother, cousin, and grandson, member of this household, that village, this tribe." These are not characteristics that belong to human beings accidentally, to be stripped away in order to discover the real me. They are part of my substance, defining partially at least, and sometimes wholly my obligations and my duties. Quote, "Inner conflicts are for it necessarily au fond the confrontation of one contingent arbitrariness by another. It is a self with no given continuities, save those of the body which is its bearer, and of the memory, which to the best of its ability gathers in its past." Ch3, on the emotivist self. The predecessor culture and Enlightenment project of justifying morality. Chapter 4 introduces what MacIntyre calls the Enlightenment project of justifying morality, the 18th century attempt to provide a rational, secular foundation for moral rules that had lost their traditional theological and teleological grounding. The key episodes in the social history that transformed and fragmented morality were, in MacIntyre's account, episodes in the history of philosophy. Though he immediately acknowledges how strange this claim will sound in a culture where academic philosophy is a marginal and specialized activity. Professors of philosophy do from time to time seek to wear the clothes of relevance, but both they and the larger public would find it surprising, and the larger public even more surprising, if it were suggested that the roots of contemporary moral disorder lie in philosophical arguments, and that we cannot understand or solve our practical social problems without understanding those philosophical roots. Yet this might become less implausible if the thesis were cast in historical form. For the claim is that both our general culture and our academic philosophy are in central part the offspring of a culture in which philosophy did constitute a central form of social activity, in which its role and function was very unlike that which it has with us. It was, MacIntyre argues, the failure of that culture to solve its problems at once practical and philosophical, which was and perhaps the key factor in determining the form both of our academic philosophical problems and of our practical social problems. What was that culture? One reason why the unity and coherence of the 18th century culture of enlightenment sometimes escapes us is that we too often understand it as primarily an episode in French cultural history. In fact, France is, from the standpoint of that culture itself, the most backward of the enlightened nations. The French themselves often avowedly looked to English models, but England in turn was overshadowed by the achievements of the Scottish Enlightenment. The greatest figures of all were certainly German, Kant and Mozart. But for intellectual variety as well as intellectual range, not even the Germans can outmatch David Hume, Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, John Miller, Lord Keynes, and Lord Monboddo. What the French lacked was threefold: a secularized Protestant background, an educated class which linked the servants of government, the clergy and the lay thinkers in a single reading public, and a newly alive type of university exemplified in Königsberg in the east and in Edinburgh and Glasgow in the west. The French 18th century intellectuals constitute an intelligentsia, a group at once educated and alienated. The Scottish, English, Dutch, Danish, and Prussian intellectuals are on the contrary at home in the social world, even when they are highly critical of it. Hence what we're dealing with is a culture that is primarily Northern European, a musical culture, and there is perhaps a closer relationship between this fact and the central philosophical problems of the culture than has usually been recognized. When the Catholic Mass becomes a genre available for concert performance by Protestants, when we listen to the Scripture because of what Bach wrote rather than because of what Street Matthew wrote, then sacred texts are being preserved in a form in which the traditional links with belief have been broken, even for those who still count themselves believers. Mozart's Freemasonry, which is perhaps the religion of enlightenment par excellence, stands in as ambiguous a relationship to the magic flute as does Handel's Messiah to Protestant Christianity. This is a culture in which there has been not only the secularization of Protestantism, but also, even for those who believe, a change in the modes of belief. And key questions arise about the justification of belief, and most of all about the justification of moral belief. We are so accustomed to classifying judgments in terms of morality that we forget how relatively new the notion was in the culture of the Enlightenment. In Latin, as in ancient Greek, there is no word correctly translated by our word moral until our word is translated back into Latin. Moralis, like its Greek predecessor, ethikos, Cicero invented moralis to translate the Greek into the Phaedo, means pertaining to character, where a man's character is nothing other than his set of dispositions to behave systematically in one way rather than another. In these early uses, moral contrasts neither with prudential nor with legal or religious. The word to which it is closest in meaning is perhaps simply practical. Its subsequent history is one in which it first becomes part of the expression moral virtue, and then becomes a predicate in its own right with a continual tendency to narrow its meaning. Until, in the late 17th century, it is used for the first time in its most restricted sense of all, that in which it has to do primarily with sexual behavior. In the period from roughly 1630 to 1850, when morality acquired a sense at once general and specific, it became the name for that particular sphere in which rules of conduct, which are neither theological nor legal nor aesthetic, are allowed a cultural space of their own. It is only in the later 17th century and the 18th century when the distinguishing of the moral from the theological, the legal, and the aesthetic has become a received doctrine, that the project of providing a rational justification for morality becomes central. The predecessor culture that the Enlightenment inherited was a world in which moral judgments had been intelligible within a framework of classical theism and Aristotelian teleology. Moral sentences were used to make claims which were true or false, hypothetical insofar as they express what conduct would be teleologically appropriate. You ought to do so and so, if and since your telos is such and such, and categorical insofar as they reported the contents of the universal law commanded by God. You ought to do so and so. That is what God's law enjoins. The Enlightenment sought to justify morality without either teleology or theism. Take away both the hypothetical and the categorical grounding, and what remains is a bare imperative with no clear status. The three great rivals of the Enlightenment project were Kant, Hume, and Kierkegaard, and MacIntyre's devastating claim, developed through the remainder of Chapter 4, is that the vindication of each position was made to rest in crucial part upon the failure of the other two. Hume founded morality on the passions because his arguments had excluded the possibility of founding it on reason. In Le Neveu de Rameau, the younger Rameau challenges Diderot's philosophe. Why regard the long run if immediacy is sufficiently enticing? Does not the philosophe's view entail that we ought to obey moral rules only when and insofar as they serve our desires? In the treatise, Hume denied explicitly that any innate spring of altruism could bridge the gap between self-interest and moral obligation. In the inquiry, he felt compelled to invoke sympathy, a philosophical fiction intended to bridge what is logically unbridgeable. Kant founded morality on reason because his arguments had excluded the passions. Central to his moral philosophy are two theses. If the rules of morality are rational, they must be the same for all rational beings. And if they are binding on all rational beings, the contingent ability of such beings to carry them out must be unimportant. What matters is their will. Kant rejects founding morality on happiness, too vague and shifting, and on divine command. We would need an independent moral standard to judge God's commands worthy of obedience. The test for a proposed maxim is whether we can consistently will that everyone should always act on it. Yet Kant's own arguments involve notoriously bad reasoning, as when he claims that willing suicide contradicts an impulse to life implanted in all of us, which is as if willing short hair contradicted an impulse to hair growth. Many immoral maxims pass Kant's test as convincingly as the moral maxims he aspires to uphold. Kierkegaard, in Inteneller, presents the aesthetic and ethical ways of life through pseudonymous voices and offers no rational grounds for choosing between them. For first principles, prior to any chain of reasoning, cannot be supported by more ultimate reasons. Yet he combines the notion of radical choice with an unquestioning conception of the ethical, promise-keeping, truth-telling, and benevolence embodied in universalizable moral principles, with marriage as the paradigm. The ethical is presented as that realm in which principles have authority over us independently of our attitudes. Yet those principles are to be adopted for no reason, by a choice that lies beyond reasons. The contradiction is plain. That which we adopt without reason cannot have authority over us. Kierkegaard is providing a new philosophical underpinning for an older, inherited way of life. And it is this deeply incoherent combination of the novel and the inherited which is the logical outcome of the Enlightenment's project. Philosophy is cultural history. MacIntyre insists that the history of philosophy and the history of political action are not two separate histories. There are not two pasts, one populated only by actions, the other only by theories. Every action is the bearer and expression of more or less theory-laden beliefs and concepts. The Enlightenment project, the 18th century attempt to provide a rational, secular foundation for moral rules after the loss of their theological and teleological grounding, undertaken by Kant, Hume, and Kierkegaard, each of whose vindication rested on the perceived failure of the others. Quote, "Moral judgments are linguistic survivals from the practices of classical theism, which have lost the context provided by these practices. Shall? Quote, take away from them that in virtue of which they were hypothetical and that in virtue of which they were categorical. And what are they? Moral judgments lose any clear status, and the sentences which express them in a parallel way lose any undebatable meaning. Shall? Why the Enlightenment project of justifying morality had to fail. Chapter 5 explains why the Enlightenment project failed, and the explanation is structural rather than contingent. It was not that the wrong philosophers were chosen, but that the enterprise itself was misconceived. If the failure were merely the failure of a succession of particular arguments, we might wait for some more powerful mind to apply itself to the problems. But the failure was of another kind entirely. The arguments of Kierkegaard, Kant, Diderot, Hume, Smith, and their contemporaries fail because of certain shared characteristics deriving from their highly specific shared historical background. We cannot understand them as contributors to a timeless debate about morality, but only as the inheritors of a very specific scheme of moral beliefs whose internal incoherence ensured the failure of the common philosophical project from the outset. All the contributors agree to a surprising degree on the content and character of the precepts which constitute genuine morality. Marriage and the family are au fond as unquestioned by Diderot's rationalist philosophe as they are by Kierkegaard's Judge Wilhelm. Promise-keeping and justice are as inviolable for Hume as they are for Kant. Whence did they inherit these shared beliefs? Obviously from their shared Christian past, compared with which the divergences between Kant's Lutheran, Hume's Presbyterian, and Diderot's Jansenist-influenced Catholic background are relatively unimportant. At the same time, they agree upon what a rational justification of morality would have to be. Its key premises would characterize some feature of human nature, and the rules of morality would then be explained and justified as those rules which a being possessing just such a human nature could be expected to accept. For Diderot and Hume, the relevant features are characteristics of the passions. For Kant, the relevant feature is the universal and categorical character of certain rules of reason. For Kierkegaard, who no longer attempts to justify morality at all, the structure is the same except that he invokes characteristics of fundamental decision-making. Any project of this form was bound to fail because of an ineradicable discrepancy between their shared conception of moral rules and their shared conception of human nature. Consider the general form of the moral scheme, which was the historical ancestor of both conceptions, the scheme which, in diverse forms, dominated the European Middle Ages from the 12th century onwards, including both classical and theistic elements. Its basic structure is that which Aristotle analyzed in the Nicomachean Ethics. Within that teleological scheme, there is a fundamental contrast between man as he happens to be and man as it could be if realized as essential nature. Ethics is the science which enables men to understand how they make the transition from the former state to the latter. The precepts which enjoin the virtues and prohibit the vices instruct us how to move from potentiality to act, how to realize our true nature, and to reach our true end. This scheme is complicated but not essentially altered when placed within a framework of theistic beliefs. The precepts of ethics are understood as teleological injunctions and as expressions of a divinely ordained law, while the threefold structure of untutored human nature it could be if it realized its telos, and the precepts of rational ethics as the means of transition remain central. This large area of agreement does not survive when Protestantism and Jansenist Catholicism appear on the scene. Reason can supply, so these new theologies assert, no genuine comprehension of man's true end. That power was destroyed by the fall of man. Nonetheless, the contrast between man as he happens to be and man as it could have realized as telos remains, and the divine moral law is still a schoolmaster to remove us from the former state to the latter. Pascal recognizes that the Protestant cum Jansenist conception of reason is at one with the conception at home in the most innovative 17th century philosophy and science. Reason is calculative. It can assess truths of fact and mathematical relations, but nothing more. In the realm of practice, it can speak only of means. About ends, it must be silent. Even Kant retains these negative characteristics. Reason discerns no essential natures and no teleological features in the objective universe. All reject any teleological view of human nature, any view of man as having an essence which defines his true end. The joint effect of the secular rejection of theology and the scientific and philosophical rejection of Aristotelianism was to eliminate any notion of man as it could be for realized as telos. Since the whole point of ethics is to enable man to pass from his present state to his true end, the elimination of any notion of essential human nature, and with it the abandonment of any notion of a telos, leaves behind a moral scheme composed of two remaining elements whose relationship becomes quite unclear. There is on the one hand a certain content for morality, a set of injunctions deprived of their teleological context. There is on the other hand a certain view of untutored human nature as it is. Since the moral injunctions were originally at home in a scheme in which their purpose was to correct, improve, and educate that human nature, they're clearly not going to be such as could be deduced from true statements about human nature or justified by appealing to its characteristics. The 18th century moral philosophers engaged in what was an inevitably unsuccessful project. They inherited incoherent fragments of a once coherent scheme of thought, and since they did not recognize their own peculiar historical and cultural situation, they could not recognize the impossible and quixotic character of their self-appointed task. Each philosopher, in his negative arguments, moved toward an increasingly unrestricted version of the claim that no valid argument can move from entirely factual premises to any moral or evaluative conclusion. Hume still expresses this as a doubt. Kant and Kierkegaard assert it positively. Later moral philosophers describe this thesis as the truth of logic. Yet the alleged unrestrictedly general logical principle is bogus. A.N. Pryor showed that from "he is a sea captain," the conclusion may be validly inferred that he ought to do whatever a sea captain ought to do. The adherents of the "no ought from" is view might reformulate their claim as holding that no conclusion with substantial evaluative and moral content can be derived from factual premises. But their claim may still have substance, deriving not from a general logical principle, but from the meaning of the key terms employed. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the meaning and implications of the key terms used in moral utterance changed their character. Consider counterexamples involving functional concepts. From this watch is grossly inaccurate, the evaluative conclusion validly follows that this is a bad watch. From factual premises about a farmer's yields and prizes, the conclusion validly follows that he is a good farmer. Such arguments are valid because watch and farmer are functional concepts defined in terms of purpose or function. The criterion of something's being a watch and the criterion of something's being a good watch are not independent of each other. Moral arguments within the classical Aristotelian tradition involve at least one central functional concept: man understood as having an essential nature and an essential purpose. Man stands to good man as watch stands to good watch. Aristotle takes it as a starting point that the relationship of man to living well is analogous to that of harpist to playing the harp well. This use of man as a functional concept is rooted in forms of social life. To be a man is to fill a set of roles, each with its own point and purpose. Member of a family, citizen, soldier, philosopher, servant of God. It is only when man is thought of as an individual prior to and apart from all roles that man ceases to be a functional concept. For this to be so, other key moral terms must also have changed their meaning. The loss of the possibility of justification signals a correlative change in the meaning of moral idioms. The know-ought from is principle becomes an inescapable truth for philosophers whose culture possesses only the impoverished moral vocabulary which results from the episodes MacIntyre has recounted. That it was taken to be a timeless logical truth was a sign of a deep lack of historical consciousness. Within the Aristotelian tradition, to call something good is to say that it is the kind of thing which someone would choose who wanted it for the purpose for which such things are characteristically wanted. To call an action just is to say that it is what a good man would do. Once essential human purposes disappear from morality, it begins to appear implausible to treat moral judgments as factual statements. Kant understands moral judgments as imperatives, and imperatives are not susceptible of truth or falsity. In everyday discourse, the habit of speaking of moral judgments as true or false persists. But the question of what it is in virtue of which a particular moral judgment is true or false has come to lack any clear answer. Negative arguments as motive. Each of the three great Enlightenment moral philosophers was driven primarily by negative arguments, by the perceived failure of the alternatives, rather than by positive grounds for his own position. The fiction of sympathy. Hume's invocation of sympathy in the Inquiry was a retreat from his explicit denial in the treatise that any innate spring of altruism could bridge the gap between self-interest and moral obligation. Functional concepts. Within the classical tradition, man is a functional concept like watch or farmer. The rejection of teleology destroyed the conceptual basis on which moral conclusions could be validly inferred from factual premises. Negative arguments as motive. Each of the three great Enlightenment moral philosophers was driven primarily by negative arguments, by the perceived failure of the alternatives, rather than by positive grounds for his own position. The fiction of sympathy. Hume's invocation of sympathy in the Inquiry was a retreat from his explicit denial in the treatise that any innate spring of altruism could bridge the gap between self-interest and moral obligation. The self-defeating structure. The Enlightenment project was self-defeating because its three rival foundations, reason, passion, choice, each undermined the others, leaving morality without any public, shared rationale. Quote, "The vindication of each position was made to rest in crucial part upon the failure of the other two, and the sum total of the effective criticism of each position by the others turned out to be the failure of all." Quote, "Just as Hume seeks to found morality on the passions because his arguments have excluded the possibility of founding it on reason, so Kant founds it on reason because his arguments have excluded the possibility of founding it on the passions, and Kierkegaard on criterionless fundamental choice because of what he takes to be the compelling nature of the considerations which exclude both reason and the passions." Quote, "In a world of secular rationality, religion could no longer provide such a shared background and foundation for moral discourse and action, and the failure of philosophy to provide what religion could no longer furnish was an important cause of philosophy losing its central cultural role and becoming a marginal, narrowly academic subject." Some consequences of the failure of the Enlightenment project. Chapter 6 traces the consequences of this failure. Consequences that are at once social, political, and existential. Abstract changes in moral concepts are always embodied in real, particular events. There is a history yet to be written in which the Medici princes, Henry VIII and Thomas Cromwell, Frederick the Great and Napoleon, Jefferson and Robespierre, Walpole and Wilberforce, are understood as expressing in their actions, often partially and in a variety of different ways, the very same conceptual changes which at the level of philosophical theory are articulated by Machiavelli and Hobbes, by Diderot and Condorcet, by Hume and Adam Smith and Kant. The transition into modernity was a single transition in both theory and practice, and the modern academic curriculum separation of the history of political action from the history of philosophy is itself a symptom of the fragmentation it fails to diagnose. Every action is the bearer and expression of more or less theory-laden beliefs and concepts. Every piece of theorizing and every expression of belief is a political and moral action. The problems of modern moral theory emerge clearly as the product of the Enlightenment's failure. On the one hand, the individual moral agent, freed from hierarchy and teleology, conceives of himself as sovereign in his moral authority. On the other hand, the inherited, if partially transformed rules of morality have to be found some new status, deprived as they have been of their older teleological character and their even more ancient categorical character as expressions of divine law. If such rules cannot be found a new status which will make appeal to them rational, appeal to them will appear as a mere instrument of individual desire and will. Hence, there is a pressure to vindicate them either by devising some new teleology or by finding some new categorical status for them. The first project is what lends its importance to utilitarianism, the second to all those attempts to follow Kant in presenting the authority of moral rules as grounded in the nature of practical reason. Both attempts failed, but in the course of the attempt social as well as intellectual transformations were accomplished. Bentham's innovative psychology provided a view of human nature in light of which the problem of assigning a new status to moral rules could be clearly stated. Traditional morality was pervaded by superstition. Only when we understood that the only motives for human action are attraction to pleasure and aversion to pain could we state the principles of an enlightened morality, for which the prospect of the maximum pleasure provides a telos. Bentham took pleasure to be the name of a type of sensation varying only in number, intensity, and duration, a false view that Mill's successors were apt to see as the major source of utilitarianism's difficulties. But the crucial transition is from a psychological thesis that mankind has two and only two motives to the moral thesis that we ought always to perform that action which will produce the greatest happiness of the greatest number. It took a nervous breakdown by John Stuart Mill, the first Benthamite child and clearly the most distinguished mind ever to embrace Benthamism, to make clear that the derivation of morality from psychology does not hold. Mill attempted to distinguish higher and lower pleasures, but the effect of these emendations is to suggest that the notion of human happiness is not a unitary, simple notion and cannot provide a criterion for making our key choices. The pleasure of drinking Guinness is not the pleasure of swimming at Crane's Beach. The happiness of the cloister is not the happiness of military life. Different pleasures and different happinesses are to a large degree incommensurable. Hence, the notion of the greatest happiness of the greatest number is a pseudo-concept available for a variety of ideological uses, but no more than that. Sidgwick recognized both that utilitarian moral injunctions could not be derived from psychological foundations, and that precepts enjoining the pursuit of the general happiness are logically independent of precepts enjoining the pursuit of our own happiness. Our basic moral beliefs, he concluded unhappily, do not form any kind of unity. They are irreducibly heterogeneous, and their acceptance is and must be unargued. With Sidgwick, the failure to restore a teleological framework for ethics finally comes to be accepted. The analytical moral philosophy of the 20th century, Gowerth's attempt to derive rights from the necessary goods of rational agency, is MacIntyre's exemplary case, fares no better. Gowerth argues that anyone who holds the prerequisites for rational agency to be necessary goods is logically committed to holding that he has a right to these goods. But the introduction of the concept of a right needs justification. A claim that I have a right to do something is quite different from a claim that I need or want something. For from the first it follows that others ought not to interfere with my attempts whether it is for my own good or not, while from the second it does not. Rights presuppose the existence of a socially established set of rules coming into existence at particular historical periods under particular social circumstances. They are in no way universal features of the human condition. I take it, then, that both 19th century utilitarianism and 20th century analytical moral philosophy are alike unsuccessful attempts to rescue the autonomous moral agent from the predicament in which the failure of the Enlightenment project left him. The price paid for liberation from the external authority of traditional morality was the loss of any authoritative content from the would-be moral utterances of the newly autonomous agent. Each moral agent now spoke unconstrained by divine law, natural teleology, or hierarchical authority. But why should anyone else listen? It was, and is to this question, that both utilitarianism and analytical moral philosophy must be understood as attempting to give cogent answers, and both fail. Nonetheless, almost everyone continues to speak and write as if one of these projects had succeeded, and hence derives one of the features of contemporary moral discourse, the gap between the meaning of moral expressions and the ways in which they are put to use. Contemporary moral experience has a paradoxical character. Each of us is taught to see himself as an autonomous moral agent, but each of us also becomes engaged by modes of practice, aesthetic or bureaucratic, which involve us in manipulative relationships with others. Seeking to protect the autonomy we have learned to prize, we aspire not to be manipulated by others. Seeking to incarnate our own principles in the world of practice, we find no way open except by directing toward others those very manipulative modes of relationship which each of us aspires to resist. The incoherence of our attitudes arises from the incoherent conceptual scheme which we have inherited. Three other concepts have a key place in the distinctively modern moral scheme: rights, protest, and unmasking. By rights, MacIntyre means those alleged to belong to human beings as such, natural rights or the rights of man. There is no expression in any ancient or medieval language correctly translated by a right until near the close of the Middle Ages. The concept lacks any means of expression in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic before about 1400. From this, it does not follow that there are no natural rights. It only follows that no one could have known that there were. But the truth is plain. There are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and unicorns. Every attempt to give good reasons for believing that there are such rights has failed. Whether the appeal is to self-evident truths, to intuitions, to the United Nations Declaration of 1949, or to Dworkin's concession that the existence of rights cannot be demonstrated. Natural or human rights are fictions, just as is utility, but fictions with highly specific properties. They purport to provide an objective and impersonal criterion, but they do not. The concept of rights was generated to serve one set of purposes as part of the social invention of the autonomous moral agent. The concept of utility was devised for quite another. Both were elaborated as substitute artifacts for concepts of an older and more traditional morality, substitutes that had to have a radically innovative character if they were to give even an appearance of performing their new social functions. Hence, when claims invoking rights are matched against claims appealing to utility, it is not surprising that there is no rational way of deciding which type of claim is to be given priority. Moral incommensurability is itself the product of a particular historical conjunction. This provides an insight important for understanding the politics of modern societies. The culture of bureaucratic individualism results in characteristic overt political debates being between an individualism which makes its claims in terms of rights and forms of bureaucratic organization which make their claims in terms of utility. If the concept of rights and that of utility are a matching pair of incommensurable fictions, the moral idiom employed can at best provide a semblance of rationality for the modern political process, but not its reality. Protest becomes a distinctive moral feature of the modern age, because protest is now almost entirely a reaction to the alleged invasion of someone's rights in the name of someone else's utility. The self-assertive shrillness of protest arises because the facts of incommensurability ensure that protesters can never win an argument. The indignant self-righteousness arises because they can never lose one either. Unmasking the unacknowledged motives of arbitrary will and desire which sustain the moral masks of modernity is itself one of the most characteristically modern of activities. From the evangelicals who saw Enlightenment morality as a disguise for selfishness, through Bloomsbury's mockery of Victorian piety, to Freud's presentation of the inherited conscience as superego. The social and political consequences extend to the character of the modern self. Modern societies oscillate between two forms of life: a freedom which is nothing but a lack of regulation of individual behavior, and forms of collectivist control designed only to limit the anarchy of self-interest. Individualism and bureaucracy are partners as well as antagonists. The freedom of the one requires the regulation of the other. This is bureaucratic individualism, the cultural climate in which the emotivist self is naturally at home. What is crucial is that on which the contending parties agree, namely that there are only two alternative modes of social life open to us: one in which the free and arbitrary choices of individuals are sovereign, and one in which the bureaucracy is sovereign, precisely so that it may limit the free and arbitrary choices of individuals. Sartre and Goffman describe this self, but MacIntyre's crucial point is that they are not offering timeless descriptions of the human condition. They're describing the historically produced character of what is specifically modern. Solzhenitsyn has understood so well that both ways of life are in the long run intolerable. When the distinctively modern self was invented, its invention required not only a largely new social setting, but one defined by a variety of not always coherent beliefs and concepts. And it is to the question of what that invention amounted to and its part in creating our own emotivist culture that MacIntyre now turns. Quote, "Every action is the bearer and expression of more or less theory-laden beliefs and concepts. Every piece of theorizing and every expression of belief is a political and moral action." Quote, "Given this deep cultural agreement, it is unsurprising that the politics of modern societies oscillate between a freedom which is nothing but a lack of regulation of individual behavior and forms of collectivist control designed only to limit the anarchy of self-interest." Fact, explanation, and expertise. Chapter 7 dismantles the fact-value distinction that has dominated modern philosophy since Hume, showing that the concept of a fact has itself been emptied of the teleological content it once carried. MacIntyre traces the genealogy. Fact is in modern culture a folk concept with an aristocratic ancestry. When Lord Chancellor Bacon enjoined his followers to abjure speculation and collect facts, Aubrey took this to mean gathering items with the same enthusiasm one might collect spode china, a magpie conception of observation that the early Royal Society members recognized as unscientific, even though it was closer to Bacon's literal inductivism than their own practice. The modern observer, MacIntyre explains, does not confront facts face-to-face without any theoretical interpretation interposing itself. Perceivers without concepts, as Kant almost said, are blind. The empiricist concept of experience was a cultural invention of the 17th and 18th centuries, intended to close the gap between seems and is, but it created a radically incoherent worldview by coexisting with natural science in the same culture. Natural science teaches us to attend to some experiences rather than to others, and only when cast into the proper form for scientific attention. The lenses of the telescope and microscope are given priority over the lenses of the eye. Theory is required to support observation just as much as observation supports theory. The crucial transformation occurred when the Aristotelian understanding of nature was repudiated. For the medieval period, mechanisms were efficient causes in a world to be comprehended ultimately in terms of final causes. Every species has a natural end, And to explain the movements of and changes in an individual is to explain how that individual moves toward the end appropriate to members of that particular species. On the Aristotelian view, human action must be characterized with reference to the hierarchy of goods that provide the ends of human action. The facts about human action include the facts about what is valuable to human beings. On the mechanist view, human action must be characterized without any reference to such goods. Fact becomes value-free, becomes a stranger to aught, and explanation, as well as evaluation, changes its character as a result of this divorce between is and ought. Quine's argument in Word and Object reinforces the point from the opposite direction. Any genuine science of human behavior must eliminate intentional expressions, references to beliefs, purposes, and reasons for action, because they involve internal complexity that cannot be mapped onto the predicate calculus. But if it proved impossible to eliminate references to such items, that understanding could not take the form of law-like generalizations. An Aristotelian account of human behavior involves an ineliminable reference to such items. Hence the incompatibility of mechanical explanation with Aristotelianism. The chapter culminates in MacIntyre's claim that the concept of managerial effectiveness functions as a moral fiction, the most culturally powerful of all such fictions. The manager's claim to authority rests on possession of factual, law-like generalizations that would enable prediction and control, but the kind of knowledge required to sustain such claims does not exist. Managerial effectiveness functions, much as Carnap and heirs suppose God to function. It is the name of a fictitious, but believed-in reality, appeal to which disguises certain other realities. Its effective use is expressive. The claim to expertise and the claim to moral neutrality are both part of a masquerade. To a disturbing extent, our morality will be disclosed as a theater of illusions. The transformation of fact. The concept of fact is not a timeless category, but a historical product. What counts as a fact about human beings depends on whether one operates within an Aristotelian framework, where facts include facts about ends and goods, or a mechanist framework, where facts are value-free. The theory-observation entanglement. Observations are always theory-laden. The empiricist fiction of uninterpreted experience was invented to close the gap between seems and is, but succeeded only by creating a radically incoherent worldview. Managerial effectiveness as moral fiction. The concept of managerial effectiveness functions like the emotivist concept of good. It purports to name a real property, but in fact expresses attitudes while disguising this fact. Quote, fact becomes value-free, becomes a stranger to aught, and explanation, as well as evaluation, changes its character as a result of this divorce between is and ought. Quote, managerial effectiveness functions, much as Carnap and heir suppose God to function. It is the name of a fictitious, but believed-in reality, appeal to which disguises certain other realities. Its effective use is expressive. Quote, what the manager makes to effectiveness rests, of course, on the further claim to possess a stock of knowledge by means of which organizations and social structures can be molded. The character of generalizations in social science and their lack of predictive power. Chapter 8 completes the argument Chapter 7 began against managerial expertise, where Chapter 7 showed that managerial effectiveness functions as a moral fiction, like Carnap and heirs God, a believed-in reality whose effective use is expressive. Chapter 8 asks what knowledge would sustain that fiction and demonstrates that it does not exist. What the manager requires for vindication is a justified conception of social science as providing law-like generalizations with strong predictive power, precisely the conception that has dominated the philosophy of social science from the Enlightenment through Kant and Mill to Hempel. On that conventional account, the social sciences explain social phenomena by supplying generalizations that do not differ in logical form from those of the natural sciences. Yet the salient fact about those sciences is the absence of any such discoveries. Occasional claims to have found true laws. The Phillips curve in economics, Homans' thesis that frequent interaction breeds liking, turn out to be false, often so unquestionably false that only a professional social scientist dominated by the conventional philosophy of science could have been tempted to believe them. One might expect practitioners to reject a philosophy their disciplines so conspicuously fail to deliver. That this has not occurred is intelligible, without law-like generalizations. The grounds for employing social scientists as expert advisors become unclear and managerial expertise is imperiled. The record confirms the vulnerability. No economist predicted stagflation. Sophisticated OECD forecasts have underperformed naive extrapolation. Demography has fared worse. Most sociologists keep no systematic records of predictions, and Deutsch, Platt, and Singer's list of 62 alleged achievements assesses predictive power in not a single case. Yet the social sciences are not devoid of achievement. Their true accomplishments have been concealed by systematic misinterpretation. Consider four distinguished generalizations. Davies on disappointed rising expectations and revolution. Newman on crime rates and building height. Bittner on police versus courtroom understandings of law. The Feyerabends on modernization and political violence. All rest on impressive research. Yet all four share three characteristics. They coexist with recognized counterexamples in ways that would destroy a physical law. They lack scope modifiers specifying the conditions under which they hold, and they do not entail well-defined counterfactuals. They are not laws, whatever else they may be. The reply that social science discovers probabilistic generalizations misses the point. Statistical mechanics is as law-like as Newtonian mechanics, while these generalizations resemble neither. The social sciences have modeled themselves on Kant, Mill, and Buckle. Enlightenment thinkers who were infant Hempelians, for whom to explain is to invoke a law retrospectively, and to predict is to invoke one prospectively. On this view, an unpredicted war should disgrace a political scientist as an unpredicted eclipse disgraces an astronomer. Explanations for persistent failure multiply, yet perhaps none is needed. Charles II invited the Royal Society to explain why a dead fish weighs more than the same fish alive, and subtle explanations were offered until he pointed out that it does not. Machiavelli believed passionately in generalizations, furnishing maxims for practice, yet held that fortuna remains ineliminable. Given the best stock of generalizations, we may be defeated by an unpredicted counterexample and see no way to improve upon them, yet still have no reason to abandon or reformulate them. If Machiavelli was right, the condition of Davies' thesis and its companions is what we should expect of successful social science, not failure. MacIntyre identifies four systematic sources of unpredictability. The first is radical conceptual innovation. As Popper showed with the wheel, to predict an invention, one must describe it, and to describe a radically new concept is to invent it. The notion of predicting radical conceptual innovation is itself conceptually incoherent. Jules Verne and Icarus do not refute the thesis, for flying machines built from existing concepts are prophecy, not rationally grounded prediction. Church's theorem extends the point. The future of mathematics, hence of physics and our physics-based society, is in principle unpredictable. The second arises from unmade decisions. I cannot predict my own choices under the descriptions defining the alternatives. Not, as a chess player might predict matching his twin's move, under the description the same move as yesterday, but under move the knight, or move the bishop. No observer can predict how his own future actions will reshape mine, and I am among those others. Omniscience excludes decision-making. It is insofar as we differ from God that unpredictability invades our lives. The third is the game-theoretic character of social life. To predict your move, I must predict what you predict, I will predict, an indefinite reflexivity. Real labor management government negotiations compound this. Union leaders approaching retirement, employers seeking future contracts, and officials contemplating office play several games at once, and moving one's knight to QB3 may be answered with a lob across the net. Lee did not know it was the Battle of Gettysburg. computer simulations that transfer past determinate situations to future indeterminate ones can fuse retrospective with prospective standpoints, as Vietnam War models discovered at TET. The fourth is pure contingency. Cleopatra's nose, William III molehill, Napoleon's cold at Waterloo. Contingencies no battle plan can fully allow for. Unpredictability does not entail inexplicability, and all four sources would afflict even determinate computers simulating human behavior. It does indeed seem likely that we are these computers. Predictability and unpredictability interlock throughout social life. Scheduling and coordinating action. The normal day, shelling subjects converging on noon under the clock at Grand Central. Furnish systematic predictability alongside statistical regularities and causal knowledge of nature and society. Without these, we could not plan. With them alone, we could not secure our plans. The degree of predictability our institutions possess enables the long-term projects, marriage, institutions, remembrance across generations, without which life lacks characteristically human intention. Pervasive unpredictability renders every plan permanently vulnerable. We also need opacity against others' predictive ambitions. Attention Enlightenment progressivism failed to register when it treated fragility as a problem soluble by better science. The practical implications complete Chapter 7's case against managerial expertise, the claim that managers possess a stock of knowledge by which organizations can be molded. Burns and Stalker showed that effective organizations must tolerate high internal unpredictability. Attempts to routinize subordinates suppress intelligence and turn their energies to frustrating superiors' projects. A wholly predictable organization committed to a wholly predictable society is therefore doomed. Doomed by the facts about social life, though totalitarian attempts may persist a very long run. We can limit Fortuna's sovereignty by improvements in knowledge. We cannot dethrone her. Managerial effectiveness is the most important contemporary moral fiction. Belief in expertise resembles Carnap and Ayre's God, an illusion of power, not ourselves, that claims righteousness. Our social order is, in a very literal sense, out of anyone's control. Bureaucratic claims to objectivity function as disguised will and preference. The 18th century prophecy of scientific control has produced dramatic imitation rather than control, and the most effective bureaucrat is the best actor. Managers who plead modest competence do not thereby impugn the argument, but modest claims never legitimate power on the scale bureaucracies wield. They excuse participation in the charade. Chapter 8 closes the expertise critique and opens the fork Chapter 9 will name. If managerial knowledge and emotivist morality are both fictions, Nietzsche and Aristotle remain the genuine alternatives. The Machiavellian alternative. The social sciences have looked to the Enlightenment tradition for their philosophical ancestry, but the appropriate ancestor is Machiavelli, who understood that Fortuna is ineliminable from human affairs. Four sources of unpredictability: radical conceptual innovation, unmade decisions, game theoretic interaction, and pure contingency are not empirical limitations, but structural features of social life. Managerial effectiveness as fiction. The completion of Chapter 7's argument. Expertise without law-like generalizations is moral fiction, and the bureaucratic drama depends on histrionic success rather than predictive knowledge. Quote, "We can by improvements in our knowledge limit the sovereignty of Fortuna, bitch goddess of unpredictability. We cannot dethrone her." Quote, "Since organizational success and organizational predictability exclude one another, the project of creating a wholly or largely predictable organization committed to creating a wholly or largely predictable society is doomed, and doomed by the facts about social life." Quote, "The notion of the prediction of radical conceptual innovation is itself conceptually incoherent." Quote, Nietzsche or Aristotle. Chapter 9 is the pivot of the entire book, the point at which MacIntyre frames the alternative that structures everything that follows. The contemporary vision of the world, he argues, is predominantly Weberian. To liberals who protest that there is no single contemporary vision but a plurality of values, he replies that belief in an irreducible plurality of values is itself an insistent and central Weberian theme. To Marxists who insist the dominant worldview is Marxist, he replies that as Marxists organize and move toward power, they always do and have become Weberians in substance, even if they remain Marxists in rhetoric. For in our culture, we know of no organized movement towards power which is not bureaucratic and managerial in mode. But this Weberian vision cannot be rationally sustained. It disguises and conceals rather than illuminates. And it is Nietzsche who saw most clearly what lies beneath the disguises. It was Nietzsche's historic achievement to understand more clearly than any other philosopher, certainly more clearly than his counterparts in Anglo-Saxon emotivism and continental existentialism. Not only that what purported to be appeals to objectivity were in fact expressions of subjective will, but also the nature of the problems that this posed for moral philosophy. In The Gay Science, section 335, Nietzsche disposes in 5 swift paragraphs of both the Enlightenment project to discover rational foundations for objective morality and the confidence of the everyday moral agent that his moral practice and utterance are in good order. Nietzsche then confronts the problem this act of destruction has created. If there is nothing to morality but expressions of will, my morality can only be what my will creates. There can be no place for such fictions as natural rights, utility, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. I myself must now bring into existence new tables of what is good. This is the Nietzschean problem. How to construct a new table of what is good entirely from the resources of will. And it is in his relentlessly serious pursuit of the problem, not in his frivolous solutions, that Nietzsche's greatness lies. The parallel with Polynesian taboo is illuminating. When Cook's seamen encountered the word taboo, the native informants themselves did not really understand the word they were using, a suggestion reinforced by the ease with which Kamehameha II abolished the taboos in Hawaii 40 years later and the lack of social consequence when he did. The taboo rules had been embedded in a context which conferred intelligibility upon them. Deprive them of that context, and they appear as arbitrary prohibitions. The pointlessness of this imaginary debate arises from a shared presupposition of the contending parties, namely that the set of rules whose status and justification they are investigating provides an adequately demarcated subject matter for investigation. We know from our standpoint that the taboo rules are survivals from a previous, more elaborate cultural background, and any theory that makes them intelligible just as they are, without reference to their history, is necessarily false. The question inexorably arises: why should we think about real analytical moral philosophers such as Moore, Ross, Pritchard, Stevenson, Hare, and the rest in any different way from that in which we were thinking just now about their imaginary Polynesian counterparts? And why should we not think of Nietzsche as the Kamehameha II of the European tradition? Nietzsche's achievement was to see that what purported to be objective moral standards were survivals, and to demand the creation of new values from the resources of will alone. But MacIntyre's crucial point is that the alternatives are not exhausted by Nietzsche. There's the possibility of recovering the Aristotelian tradition, not as a dead inheritance, but as a living tradition of inquiry. The chapter closes by connecting Weber, Nietzsche, and Goffman. Nietzsche's prophetic irrationalism remains immanent in the Weberian managerial forms of our culture. In Goffman's sociology of interaction, in which success is whatever passes for success, in which there are no objective standards of achievement, provides the micro-level counterpart of the Weber-Nietzsche macro-vision. The good for man in Goffman's world consists in the possession of honor, honor being precisely whatever embodies and expresses the regard of others. But as Aristotle recognized, honor is at best a secondary good, because in virtue of which honor is assigned must be more important. The two alternatives. If the Enlightenment project has failed, the only two genuine theoretical alternatives are Nietzsche, will creates values, and Aristotle, recovery of the teleological framework. Everything else is a disguised variant of one or the other. Nietzsche as diagnostician, Nietzsche's greatness lies not in his solutions, the Übermensch, but in his diagnosis, his recognition that modern moral language consists of fragmented survivals from a lost context. The taboo analogy. Modern analytical moral philosophy is analogous to late 18th century Polynesian uses of taboo, words whose original context has been lost, deployed by practitioners who no longer understand what they mean. Quote, "It was Nietzsche's historic achievement to understand more clearly than any other philosopher, certainly more clearly than his counterparts in Anglo-Saxon emotivism and continental existentialism. Not only that what purported to be appeals to objectivity were in fact expressions of subjective will, but also the nature of the problems that this posed for moral philosophy." Quote, "If there is nothing to morality but expressions of will, my morality can only be what my will creates. There can be no place for such fictions as natural rights, utility, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. I myself must now bring into existence new tables of what is good." Ch. 9, on Nietzsche. Quote, "The pointlessness of this imaginary debate arises from a shared presupposition of the contending parties, namely that the set of rules whose status and justification they are investigating provides an adequately demarcated subject matter for investigation." Ch. 9, on taboo and moral philosophy. The virtues in heroic societies. Chapters 10 through 12 form the historical heart of MacIntyre's positive reconstruction, the story of how the virtues were understood within what he calls the classical tradition, a tradition in which Aristotle provides the central point of focus, but which is broader than Aristotelianism alone. The investigation begins not with Aristotle, but with heroic society, because the classical tradition inherited from the heroic age, and because Nietzsche, who presents the most formidable challenge to the Aristotelian enterprise, saw himself as the last inheritor of those Homeric aristocrats. In heroic society, MacIntyre explains, the chief means of moral education is the telling of stories. The Homeric poems in 6th century Athens, the Icelandic sagas written in 13th century Christian Iceland about the pagan period before AD 930, and the Ulster stories written down at the monastery of Clonmacnoise all serve the same function. They provided the historical memory of the societies in which they were written, a moral background to contemporary debate, and an account of a now transcended moral order whose beliefs and concepts were still partially influential. The understanding of heroic society, whether it ever existed or not, is a necessary part of the understanding of classical society and its successors. In such societies, the virtues are inseparable from social role and social structure. M.I. Finley wrote of Homeric society, "The basic values of society were given, predetermined, and so were a man's place in the society and the privileges and duties that followed from his status. Every individual has a given role and status within a well-defined and highly determinate system of roles and statuses. The key structures are those of kinship and the household. In Greek dine and in Anglo-Saxon ought alike, there is originally no clear distinction between ought and o. In Icelandic, the word escoildr ties together ought and is kin to. A man in heroic society is what he does. A man and his actions become identical, and he makes himself completely and adequately comprehended in them. He has no hidden depths." Frankel. The virtues just are those qualities which sustain a free man in his role, and which manifest themselves in those actions which his role requires. The word eurete, which later comes to be translated as virtue, is in the Homeric poems used for excellence of any kind. A fast runner displays the eurete of his feet. A son excels his father in every kind of eurete. Courage is central, but not simply as a quality of individuals. It is the quality necessary to sustain a household and a community. The bonds of friendship are modeled on those of kinship. Sometimes friendship is formally vowed, so that by the vow the duties of brothers are mutually incurred. Andromache and Hector, Penelope and Odysseus are friends, Philos, as much as Achilles and Patroclus. Fidelity is the key virtue for both men and women, because my friend's courage assures me of his power to aid me, and my friend's fidelity assures me of his will. What is most striking about heroic society is the unity of morality and social structure. There is only one set of social bonds. Morality, as something distinct, does not yet exist. Evaluative questions are questions of social fact. Without a place in the social order, a man would not only be incapable of receiving recognition from others, he would not himself know who he was. The heroic self lacks precisely that characteristic which modern philosophers take to be essential to selfhood, the capacity to detach oneself from any particular standpoint or point of view. In heroic society, there is no outside, except that of the stranger. A man who tried to withdraw himself from his given position in heroic society would be engaged in the enterprise of trying to make himself disappear. The heroic virtues are inseparable from the narrative form of life. Human life has a determinate form, the form of a certain kind of story. To understand courage is not just to understand how it may be exhibited in character, but also what place it can have in a certain kind of enacted story. For courage in heroic society is a capacity not just to face particular harms and dangers, but to face a particular kind of pattern of harms and dangers, a pattern in which individual lives find their place, and which such lives in turn exemplify. The man who does what he ought moves steadily towards his fate and his death, defeat and not victory that lies at the end. To understand this is itself a virtue. Indeed, it is a necessary part of courage to understand this. Life is fragile, men are vulnerable, and it is of the essence of the human situation that they are such. In heroic societies, life is the standard of value, and death is an unmixed evil. The Iliad itself transcends the moral horizon of its characters. What the poet of the Iliad sees, and his characters do not, is that winning too may be a form of losing. The poem claims for itself a form of understanding which it denies to those whose actions it describes. And what Nietzsche portrays as aristocratic self-assertion is in fact something quite different, forms of assertion proper to and required by a certain role. The self becomes what it is in heroic societies only through its role. It is a social creation, not an individual one. Hence, when Nietzsche projects back onto the archaic past his own 19th century individualism, he reveals that what looked like an historical inquiry was actually an inventive literary construction. The unity of morality and social structure. In heroic society, there is no distinction between moral questions and questions of social fact. To know what one owes is to know who one is. Courage and narrative. Courage is not merely a quality of individuals, but a quality that sustains households and communities. It is intelligible only as part of a narrative pattern of life, fate, and death. The Iliad's transcendence. The Iliad claims for the poet an understanding denied to its characters, that winning may be a form of losing, an implicit claim to objectivity incompatible with Nietzschean perspectivism. Quote, in all those cultures, Greek, medieval, or Renaissance, where moral thinking and action is structured according to some version of the scheme that I've called classical, the chief means of moral education is the telling of stories. Quote, to judge a man, therefore, is to judge his actions. By performing actions of a particular kind in a particular situation, a man gives warrant for judgment upon his virtues and vices. For the virtues just are those qualities which sustain a free man in his role, and which manifest themselves in those actions which his role requires. Quote, what the poet of the Iliad sees and his characters do not is that winning too may be a form of losing. The virtues at Athens. Chapter 11 turns to Athens, where the heroic inheritance created incoherence in the use of evaluative language. Heroic societies, as they are represented by the Homeric poems or the Icelandic or Irish sagas, may or may not have existed. But the belief that they had existed was crucial to those classical and Christian societies which understood themselves as having emerged from the conflicts of heroic society and which defined their own standpoint partially in terms of that emergence. No 5th century Athenian could behave just as Agamemnon or Achilles behaved, yet the heroic literature provided a central part of the moral scriptures of the later societies. And it is from the difficulties involved in relating those scriptures to actual practice that many of the key moral characteristics of the later societies arise. The first massive fact to reckon with is the difference it makes to the conception of the virtues when the primary moral community is no longer the kinship group, but the city-state, and not merely the city-state in general, but the Athenian democracy in particular. Sophocles and the conflict of goods. Sophocles' Philoctetes confronts us with two incompatible conceptions of honorable conduct. Odysseus behaves according to precisely the same canons which govern his behavior in the Odyssey. He does good to his friends, harm to his foes, and if he cannot get what he wants by open means, his cunning will devise deceitful means. But Neoptolemus sees Odysseus' stratagem to deceive Philoctetes as dishonorable. Philoctetes had been grossly wronged by the Greeks, and even though he now refuses to come to their aid at Troy, it is wrong to deceive him. Sophocles uses Odysseus and Neoptolemus to confront us with two incompatible conceptions of honorable conduct, two rival standards for behavior. Within the same few lines, they disagree also about what it is to be Sophos and to be Ischros. The intervention of the god Heracles rescues the characters from their impasse, and the god's appearance signals the disclosure of an incoherence in moral standards that the human characters cannot resolve on their own. The intervention of a god in Greek tragedy, or at the very least an appeal to a god to intervene, often signals the disclosure of an incoherence in moral standards and vocabulary. The pattern recurs throughout the tragic corpus. In the Orestia, archaic rules of vendetta both enjoin and forbid Orestes to kill Clytemnestra. Athena's intervention shifts the center of moral authority from the household to the polis. In Antigone, the demands of family and the demands of the city appear as rival and incompatible demands. Sophocles presents a view equally difficult for a Platonist or a Weberian to accept. There are crucial conflicts in which different virtues make rival and incompatible claims upon us, yet our situation is tragic in that we must recognize the authority of both claims. To choose does not exempt one from the authority of the claim one chose to go against. The divine verdict always ends rather than resolves the conflict, leaving unbridged the gap between acknowledgement of a cosmic order and our particular perceptions in particular situations. When Antigone and Creon contend, the life of the clan and the life of the city are weighed against each other. When Odysseus and Philoctetes confront each other, the outcome for the Greek community is in the balance. Plato, the polis, and evaluative incoherence. This is precisely the state of incoherence that Plato's dialogues diagnose. When Plato interrogates one or more Athenians as to the nature of some virtue, courage in the lackeys, piety in the Euthyphro, justice in Republic I, he convicts the other of inconsistency. The casual modern reader might easily suppose at first that Plato is contrasting Socrates' rigor with the carelessness of the ordinary Athenian. But as the pattern recurs again and again, another interpretation suggests itself, namely that Plato is pointing to a general state of incoherence in the use of evaluative language in Athenian culture. Plato's strategy in the Republic is to expel the Homeric inheritance and produce a coherent, well-integrated account of the virtues, in which the presence of each virtue requires the presence of all. Yet rival conceptions of one and the same virtue coexist and engender conflict. The nature of dikaiosune, justice, is the subject of just such disagreement, even though justice is among the cooperative rather than competitive virtues. In Philoctetes, both Neoptolemus and Odysseus claim dikaiosune for their side of the argument. There is a received set of virtue words in 5th century Greek: friendship, courage, self-restraint, wisdom, justice. But as to what each requires and why each is counted a virtue, there is extended disagreement. Those who unreflectively rely on ordinary usage will too easily find themselves trapped in inconsistency, just as Socrates' partners in dialogue so often are. The common Athenian assumption is that the virtues have their place within the social context of the city-state. In Philoctetes, it is essential that Philoctetes, left on a desert island, has been exiled not merely from the company of mankind, but from the status of a human being, You left me friendless, solitary, without a city, a corpse among the living. For Sophocles' world, friendship, companionship, and citizenship are essential and non-contestable aspects of humanity. The question of the relationship between being a good citizen and being a good man becomes central, and knowledge of the variety of possible human practices, barbarian as well as Greek, provided the factual background to the asking of that question. Athens is praised because she par excellence exhibits human life as it ought to be. Yet in these very acts of praise, Athenian particularity is distinguished from Homeric particularity. For Homeric man, there could be no standard external to those embodied in the structures of his own community. For Athenian man, the matter is more complex. His understanding of the virtues provides standards by which he can question the life of his own community. Yet he recognizes that he possesses that understanding only because membership in the community provides it. The agon, the contest, transforms from Homeric centrality through the Olympic Games and the assemblies and law courts of democracy into the conflicts at the heart of tragedy and the dialogue form of philosophical argument. Politics, drama, and philosophy were far more intimately related in the Athenian world than in our own. The producer of drama was a holder of political office, and the philosopher risked comic portrayal and political punishment. Hence, rival philosophical accounts of the virtues appear, making overt the underlying conflicts, from the sophistic ethics of success, in which Thrasymachus is Agamemnon uneducated by the Iliad's moral truth, to Callicles' systematic glorification of domination, which Socrates can trouble but not conclusively refute. Yet it is too simple to see the difference between the Homeric and the classical view as residing merely in a transition from one set of social forms to another. The forms and claims of kinship survive in substantial form. The aristocratic household preserves a good deal of Homer in life as well as in poetry, though the Homeric values no longer define the moral horizon. The conception of a virtue has become strikingly detached from any particular social role. In Homer, the question of honor is the question of what is due to a king. In Sophocles, the question of honor has become the question of what is due to a man. To adopt a stance on the virtues is to adopt a stance on the narrative character of human life, a link the heroic poets and Sophocles share, even though their answers differ. Aristotle inherits Plato's belief in the unity and harmony of both the individual soul and the city-state, which leads him to misread Sophocles. What constitutes those individuals' tragic opposition and conflict is the conflict of good, with good embodied in their encounter prior to and independent of any individual characteristics. And to this aspect of tragedy, Aristotle in the Poetics is and has to be blind. We can no longer delay turning from poetry to philosophy, from Sophocles to Aristotle. The incoherence of Athenian morality, the heroic inheritance, produced a genuine incoherence in evaluative language. Rival and incompatible conceptions of honor, duty, and justice coexisted without a framework to adjudicate between them. The transition from role to person. In the move from Homer to Sophocles, the question of virtue shifts from what is due to a king to what is due to a man, a move from role-specific to universal moral concepts. Aristotle versus Sophocles. Aristotle's moral psychology led him to misread tragedy. He saw tragic conflict as resulting from individual flaws, whereas Sophocles portrayed the conflict of good with good. Quote, "The intervention of a god in Greek tragedy, or at the very least an appeal to a god to intervene, often signals the disclosure of an incoherence in moral standards and vocabulary." Quote, "In Homer, the question of honor is the question of what is due to a king. In Sophocles, the question of honor has become the question of what is due to a man." Quote, "What constitutes those individuals' tragic opposition and conflict is the conflict of good with good embodied in their encounter prior to and independent of any individual characteristics." Aristotle's account of the virtues. Chapter 12 presents Aristotle's account of the virtues as the central achievement of the classical tradition, but also notes the tension involved in treating Aristotle as part of a tradition. since Aristotle himself envisaged his relationship to his predecessors in terms of replacement of their errors by his comprehensively true account. From the standpoint of truth, on Aristotle's own view, once his work had been done, theirs could be discarded without loss. But to think in this way is to exclude the notion of a tradition of thought, for it is central to the conception of such a tradition that the past is never something merely to be discarded, but rather that the present is intelligible only as a commentary upon and response to the past. Aristotle's importance can only be specified in terms of a kind of tradition whose existence he himself did not and could not have acknowledged. It is the later members of the tradition, successors to Aristotle, whose biblical culture has educated them to think historically, who could integrate Aristotle's account of the virtues with a thesis about the narrative form of human life. The Nicomachean voice and teleological ethics. The Nicomachean ethics is, MacIntyre observes, the most brilliant set of lecture notes ever written, and Aristotle continuously asks, what do we say on such and such a topic? Not what do I say. The we in whose name he writes is the educated Athenian citizenry. Aristotle takes himself not to be inventing an account of the virtues, but articulating an account that is implicit in the thought, utterance, and action of the best citizens of the best city-state. Every activity, every inquiry, every practice aims at some good. For by the good, or good, we mean that at which human beings characteristically aim. Human beings, like the members of all other species, have a specific nature and a specific telos, and the good is defined in terms of those characteristics. Hence Aristotle's ethics presupposes his metaphysical biology, and sets itself the task of giving an account of the good that is at once local and particular, located in the polis, and yet also cosmic and universal. The virtues are those qualities the possession of which will enable an individual to achieve eudaimonia, the state of being well and doing well in being well, and the lack of which will frustrate his movement toward that telos. But the exercise of the virtues is not a means to the end of the good for man in the ordinary contingent sense. What constitutes the good for man is a complete human life lived at its best, and the exercise of the virtues is a necessary and central part of such a life, not a mere preparatory exercise to secure such a life. We cannot characterize the good for man adequately without already having made reference to the virtues. The immediate outcome of the exercise of a virtue is a choice which issues in right action, but the exercise of such judgment is not a routinizable application of rules. There is relatively little mention of rules anywhere in the ethics. Particular cases will always arise in which it is unclear how the law is to be applied. On such occasions, we have to act kata ton or ton logon, according to right reason. Courage lies between rashness and timidity, just as between doing injustice and suffering injustice. What it is to fall into a vice cannot be adequately specified independently of circumstances. A central virtue is phronesis, practical intelligence, originally an aristocratic term of praise for one who knows what is due to him. Later, the intellectual virtue, without which none of the virtues of character can be exercised. Excellence of character and intelligence cannot be separated. For Kant, one can be both good and stupid, but for Aristotle, stupidity of certain kind precludes goodness. To act virtuously is not, as Kant was later to think, to act against inclination. It is to act from inclination formed by the cultivation of the virtues. Moral education is an education sentimental. The Aristotelian agent possesses not merely natural gifts that might occasionally produce right action, but dispositions to act and to feel in particular ways. There's a crucial distinction between what any particular individual at any particular time takes to be good for him and what is really good for him as a man, and it is for the sake of achieving this latter good that we practice the virtues. Phronesis, friendship, and the city as common project. Aristotle's account of practical reasoning holds that the conclusion to a practical syllogism is a particular kind of action, a view that states necessary conditions for intelligible human action in any recognizably human culture. Practical reasoning has four essential elements: the wants and goals of the agent, a major premise asserting what is good for a being of a certain kind, a minor premise identifying this occasion as an instance of that kind, and the action itself. The judgments that provide the agent's reasoning with premises will include judgments as to what it is good for someone like him to do and to be. Hence, reason cannot be the servant of the passions, for the education of the passions into conformity with the telos is what ethics is about. On an Aristotelian view, law and morality are not two separate realms, as they are for modernity. Knowing how to apply the law is itself possible only for someone who possesses the virtue of justice. A community whose shared aim is the realization of the human good will need both an account of the virtues and an account of those types of action absolutely prohibited, offenses whose commission requires the offender's exclusion from the community. To fail by not being good enough and to fail by committing an offense against the law are intimately related deprivations of good, but deprivations of very different kinds. Friendship is itself a virtue and the bond of the polis. Lawgivers, says Aristotle, seem to make friendship a more important aim than justice. For justice repairs failures within an already constituted community, while friendship is required for that initial constitution. The political community is conceived as a common project concerned with the whole of life, not merely with this or that good, but with man's good as such, a notion alien to the modern liberal individualist world, in which friendship has been relegated to private life. E.M. Forster's hope that he might have the courage to betray his country rather than his friend would, from an Aristotelian perspective, mark him as a citizen of nowhere. Aristotle inherits from Plato the belief in the unity of the virtues and treats conflict as an eliminable evil. Civil war is the worst of evils. Hence the agon has been displaced from its Homeric centrality. Tragedy, on Aristotle's view, results from the hero's flaw, not because the human situation is sometimes irremediably tragic. That particular appeal to the divine, which in Aeschylus and Sophocles signals recognition of tragic impasse, can have made no realistic sense for Aristotle, whose unchanging divinity furnishes man with his ultimate telos through metaphysical contemplation. Three questions, therefore, press upon later writers in the tradition. If we reject Aristotle's metaphysical biology, as we must, is there any way to preserve his teleology? If the detail of his account presupposes the vanished city-state, how can Aristotelianism be a moral presence in a world without city-states? And if conflict is not merely the result of flaws of character or unintelligent political arrangements, if Sophocles is right that good can be at war with good, what resource does Aristotelianism have for understanding the teleological character of both the virtues and the social forms that provide them with a context? John Anderson urged that we ask not what end a social institution serves, but of what conflicts it is the scene. Had Aristotle asked this question of the polis and the individual agent, he would have had an additional Sophoclean resource for understanding the virtues. Virtue as constitutive of the good. The exercise of the virtues is not a means to the good for man, but a necessary and central part of it. We cannot characterize the good for man adequately without already having made reference to the virtues. Quote, every activity, every inquiry, every practice aims at some good. For by the good, or a good, we mean that at which human beings characteristically aim. Quote, to act virtuously is not, as Kant was later to think, to act against inclination. It is to act from inclination formed by the cultivation of the virtues. Moral education is an education sentimental. Quote, what constitutes the good for man is a complete human life lived at its best, and the exercise of the virtues is a necessary and central part of such a life, not a mere preparatory exercise to secure such a life. Medieval aspects and occasions. Chapters 13 and 14 extend MacIntyre's historical reconstruction from classical Athens through the medieval period, examining how the virtues were understood within Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions that inherited and transformed the Aristotelian legacy. The tradition MacIntyre delineates is not to be confused with mere commentary upon Aristotle's texts. It always uses the Nicomachean ethics and the politics as key texts when it can, but it never surrenders itself wholly to Aristotle. It sets itself in a relationship of dialogue with him rather than in any relationship of simple assent. When a modern world systematically repudiated the classical view of human nature, it did so very precisely as Aristotelianism. Luther's buffoon who has misled the Church, Hobbes's explanation of the Reformation as due in part to bringing of the philosophy and doctrine of Aristotle into religion. Yet the medieval world encountered Aristotle relatively late. Even Aquinas encountered him only in translation, and what he provided was at best a partial solution to a medieval problem already stated time and again: how to educate and civilize human nature in a culture in which human life was in danger of being torn apart by the conflict of too many ideals, too many ways of life. Heroic memory and the law morality unity. Chapter 13 insists that the medieval world must not be misconceived as a unified, monolithic Christian culture. Of all the mythological ways of thinking which have disguised the Middle Ages, for us none is more misleading than that which portrays a unified and monolithic Christian culture. Medieval culture, insofar as it was a unity at all, was a fragile and complex balance of disparate and conflicting elements, Jewish and Islamic as well as Christian, heroic and classical, Latin and vernacular. Germans, Anglo-Saxons, Norwegians, Icelanders, Irishmen, and Welshmen all had a pre-Christian past to remember, and their social forms and poetry embodied those pasts. The memory of heroic society is present in the tradition twice over. Once as the background to 5th and 4th century Athenian society, and once again as the background to the High Middle Ages. In the 12th century, Irish monks at Clonmacnoise wrote down the stories of Ulster heroes. In 13th century Iceland, men wrote sagas about the pagan period before AD 930. The heroic literature provided a central part of the moral scriptures of those later societies, and it is from the difficulties involved in relating those scriptures to actual practice that many of the key moral characteristics of the later societies arise. The medieval order could not reject the heroic table of the virtues: loyalty to family and friends, courage, and piety. Accepting the moral limits of the cosmic order remained central, partially defined in terms of institutions, such as the code of revenge in the sagas. The moralization of medieval society lay in creating general categories of right and wrong that could replace the particular bonds and fractures of an older paganism. The relationship between law and morality was conceived in the medieval world as a single entity. There is no room for the modern liberal distinction between law and morality, and there is no room for this because of what the medieval kingdom shares with the polis, as Aristotle conceived it. The conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket is paradigmatic. Henry extended the rule of law by replacing feuds, self-help, and local custom by a more centralized system of courts. Becket represented the appeal to an absolute standard that lies beyond all secular codifications. The claim that human law is the shadow cast by divine law, that the institutions of law embody the virtue of justice. Their quarrel took place within a shared framework of detailed agreement on human and divine justice. When Becket was forced into the role of martyr, he and Henry were not in disagreement as to the criteria, meaning, and consequences of martyrdom, a crucial difference from the later quarrel between Henry VIII and Thomas More, in which rival conceptual worlds told incompatible stories about what they did. Christianization, charity, quest, and institutional creation. The 12th century posed the question of how the four cardinal virtues, justice, prudence, temperance, and courage, are to be related to the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Abelard's distinction between vice and sin retreats into interiority, treating the external social world as a set of contingent circumstances. Alan of Lille, by contrast, sees pagan writers as providing resources for answering political questions, with charity transforming natural qualities into genuine virtues leading to man's supernatural end. The virtues were shaped by the political problems of a society in which central administration of justice, universities, and the civility of urban life were all still in the process of being created. The cultural space in which they will be able to exist has yet to be located somewhere, between the particularist claims of the intense local rural community, which threatens to absorb everything into custom and local power, and the universal claims of the Church. Part of the answer lay in generating creative tensions between secular and sacred, local and national, Latin and vernacular, rural and urban, in whose context moral education went on and the virtues came to be valued and redefined. At the center of biblical religion is a conception of love for those who sin, charity, which Aristotle's universe omits. Charity is not merely one more virtue added to the list. Its inclusion alters the conception of the good for man radically, for the community in which the good is achieved has to be one of reconciliation with a history of a particular kind. The high medieval scheme makes the tale of a quest or journey a central genre. Man is essentially in via, and the end sought can redeem all that was wrong with life up to that point, a notion unintelligible in Aristotelian terms, as the story of the thief on the cross demonstrates. Forgiveness presupposes the practices of justice, but differs crucially. Justice is administered by an impersonal authority, while forgiveness can only be extended by the offended party. There is no word in the Greek of Aristotle's age correctly translated sin, repentance, or charity. It follows that in the medieval world, as in the ancient polis, the individual is identified and constituted in and through certain of his or her roles, those roles which bind the individual to the communities in and through which alone specifically human goods are to be attained. The medieval person confronts the world as a member of this family, this household, this city, this kingdom. There is no I apart from these. Even the Catholic Christian does not possess an identity prior to all social roles. I am my body, and my body is social, born to those parents in this community with a specific social identity. Solitariness is no longer what it was for Philoctetes. The anchorite carries his communal roles with him into isolation. The virtues of loyalty and justice, the military and chivalric virtues, and the virtues of purity and patience were all redefined in these contexts. Purity because the medieval world recognized how easily grasp of the supreme good may be lost by worldly distraction. Patience because it is the virtue of endurance in the face of evil. Aquinas is in important respects an unexpectedly marginal figure to this history. His exhaustive classificatory scheme and strong thesis on the unity of the virtues preclude tragedy that is not the outcome of human flaws, and his alliance of Aristotelian scientia with Christian theology demands a deductive hierarchy ill-suited to the empirical untidiness of virtue. Yet the medieval stage was in a strong sense Aristotelian in Christian, Jewish, and Islamic versions alike, as when Maimonides answered why God instituted so many holidays by citing Aristotle on friendship as the bond of human community. The unique achievement of the Middle Ages was this linking of a biblical historical perspective with an Aristotelian one in the treatment of the virtues. The medieval knot of unity. Medieval culture is not a monolithic Christian whole, but a fragile balance of disparate elements. Heroic memory, law and morality unity, secular sacred tension, whose conflicts were the occasions for moral education and the redefinition of the virtues. The medieval self as social. The medieval person is constituted by roles, family, household, city, kingdom, and even the Catholic doctrine of the soul does not produce an identity prior to social roles, because I am my body, and my body is social. Virtue and political creation. The virtues in the medieval world were shaped by the need to create institutions, justice, learning, urban civility, in a cultural space between rural custom and universal church claims. Quote, of all the mythological ways of thinking which have disguised the Middle Ages for us, none is more misleading than that which portrays a unified and monolithic Christian culture. Quote, there is no room for the modern liberal distinction between law and morality, and there is no room for this because of what the medieval kingdom shares with the polis, as Aristotle conceived it. Both are conceived as communities in which men in company pursue the human good. Quote, I am my body, and my body is social, born to those parents in this community with a specific social identity. The nature of the virtues. Chapter 14 answers the question that has been pressing throughout Part 2. What then is a virtue? MacIntyre begins by confronting the apparent objection that there are just too many different and incompatible conceptions of a virtue for there to be any real unity to the concept. Homer, Sophocles, Aristotle, the New Testament, and medieval thinkers differ from each other in too many ways. They offer us different and incompatible lists of the virtues. They give a different rank order of importance to different virtues, and they have different and incompatible theories of the virtues. The case for this objection is reinforced when we compare Homer's catalog, where physical strength counts as an arete, with Aristotle's, where friendship and phronesis are central, and with the New Testament's, where faith, hope, and love appear, while humility, which Aristotle seems to count as a vice, is praised as a virtue. Jane Austen's list introduces constancy as a virtue analogous to phronesis, and Benjamin Franklin's list reflects the values of an 18th century commercial society. Yet the multiplicity runs deeper than divergent catalogs. Each of the 5 moral outlooks MacIntyre surveys embodies not only a different list, but a different theory of what a virtue is. For Homer, a virtue is a quality whose manifestation enables someone to do what a well-defined social role requires. The concept of role is prior to the concept of virtue. For Aristotle and the New Testament, by contrast, virtue is a quality whose exercise leads toward a human telos, and a relationship of means to end is internal rather than external, a point Aquinas draws explicitly when defending Augustine's definition of virtue. Franklin's teleology is utilitarian in a different sense. Virtues are means to happiness understood as success in Philadelphia and ultimately in heaven, with utility as the criterion in each case. Jane Austen combines elements from Homer, Aristotle, and Christianity in a synthesis whose significance MacIntyre defers. But the prima facie case for fragmentation is formidable. Homer praises physical strength as arete, where we would speak of excellence rather than virtue. Yet relocating the difference does not remove it. Aristotle ranks friendship and phronesis, where Homer ranks bodily prowess, and magnanimity is available only to the rich. Each account nonetheless claims not merely theoretical, but institutional hegemony. Odysseus condemns the Cyclopes for lacking agriculture, and Agora and Themis. Aristotle condemns barbarians for lacking the polis. The New Testament knows no salvation outside the Apostolic Church. Franklin finds the virtues more at home in Philadelphia than in Paris. The question becomes whether we can disentangle from these rival claims a unitary core conception more compelling than any single historical formulation, one complex enough to embody the history of which it is the outcome. Practices and internal goods. MacIntyre's answer unfolds in 3 stages, each with its own conceptual background and each presupposing what went before. The first stage requires an account of what he calls a practice, any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity. Tic-tac-toe is not a practice. Chess is. Bricklaying is not. Architecture is. Planting turnips is not. Farming is. Physics, history, painting, politics in the Aristotelian sense, and the making and sustaining of family life all fall under the concept. The heroic societies MacIntyre examined earlier already exhibited this structure. To excel is to excel at war, or in the games, as Achilles does, in sustaining a household, as Penelope does, in counsel, as Nestor does. The distinction between internal and external goods is illustrated by MacIntyre's chess lesson. A child taught chess only for candy has every reason to cheat and none not to. But when the child comes to find in chess its own analytical skill, strategic imagination, and competitive intensity, cheating defeats not the teacher but the self. External goods, prestige, status, money, are characteristically someone's property and possession, and typically competitive. The more one has, the less remains for others. Internal goods can only be specified in terms of the practice itself and can only be identified by those with the relevant experience. Those who lack that experience are incompetent judges. MacIntyre's extended example of portrait painting from Giotto to Rembrandt shows how internal goods include both the excellence of the product and the good of a certain kind of life lived out as a painter. Goods achieved only through subordinating oneself within the practice, accepting authority, taking self-endangering risks, and responding to criticism with truthfulness. In the realm of practices, the gustibus est disputandum, subjectivist and emotivist analyses of judgment are ruled out. From this, MacIntyre derives a first, partial definition. A virtue is an acquired human quality, the possession and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to practices, and the lack of which effectively prevents us from achieving any such goods. Justice, courage, and honesty are not optional ornaments. Without them, one cannot achieve the standards of excellence internal to any practice worthy of the name. MacIntyre's examples of friendship betrayed, A, B, C, and D, and grading by blue eyes rather than merit show how departures from these standards partially define relationships, whether we acknowledge it or not, and how different societies may encode truthfulness, justice, and courage differently while still acknowledging the same virtues. To enter a practice is to enter relationship with those who have preceded us in it. Standards are not immune from criticism, yet we cannot be initiated without accepting the authority of the best standards realized so far, as one cannot learn to hear Bartok without accepting one's incapacity to judge, or to pitch without accepting that others know when to throw a fastball. Great violinists may be vicious and great chess players mean-spirited, but the vicious rely on others' virtues for the practice to flourish and deny themselves the internal goods that reward even mediocre participants. Institutions, external goods, and beyond practices. Practices must be distinguished from mere technical skills and from institutions. Chess clubs, laboratories, and hospitals are institutions. Chess, physics, and medicine are practices. Institutions are necessarily concerned with external goods, money, power, status, and distribute them as rewards. No practice can survive for long unsustained by institutions. Yet the ideals and creativity of a practice are always vulnerable to the acquisitiveness of its institutional bearer, and the cooperative care for common goods is always vulnerable to institutional competitiveness. The essential function of the virtues is to enable practices to resist that corruption. The making and sustaining of human community is itself a practice in a peculiarly close relationship to virtue. And on the Aristotelian view, political community requires the exercise of virtues for its own sustenance, whereas liberal individualism treats community as a neutral arena for self-chosen conceptions of the good. External goods are genuinely goods, objects of desire whose allocation gives point to justice and generosity. But the cultivation of truthfulness, justice, and courage will often bar us from wealth, fame, or power. The road to success in Philadelphia and the road to heaven may not coincide after all. A courageous Nazi remains courageous in some respect. To deny this obliterates the distinction between what requires moral re-education and what does not, and shows why MacIntyre cannot accept the strong Aristotelian thesis that possession of one virtue entails possession of all. Virtues may hinder as well as help the achievement of external goods. Yet we must practice them irrespective of whether contingent circumstances will produce the relevant internal goods. Otherwise, we do not possess them at all. Yet a life informed only by goods internal to practices would remain defective, torn by arbitrary conflicts between incompatible allegiances, as with T. Lawrence or Gauguin. Unable to specify justice or patience without an ordering of goods beyond any single practice, and unable to account for integrity or constancy, virtues that presuppose the wholeness of a human life. MacIntyre therefore offers his three-part definition as a whole. First, virtues as qualities enabling achievement of internal goods. Second, as qualities enabling one to be good in the way of life one is living. Third, as qualities sustaining the pursuit of the good life as a whole. Each level corresponds to a different ordering of goods, and the argument now turns to whether each human life can intelligibly be conceived as such a unity. Practice, a socially established cooperative activity through which internal goods are realized by pursuing standards of excellence that partially define the activity. Internal versus external goods. Internal goods are achievable only through the practice and recognizable only by participants. External goods are competitive and may be won through vice. 3 stages of virtue. Practices, the narrative unity of a life, and moral tradition supply the successive backgrounds against which the core concept of a virtue must be understood. Quote, "What constitutes the good for man is a complete human life lived at its best, and the exercise of the virtues is a necessary and central part of such a life, not a mere preparatory exercise to secure such a life." Quote, "The virtues are just those qualities which tend to lead to the achievement of a certain class of goods. Nonetheless, unless we practice them irrespective of whether in any particular set of contingent circumstances they will produce those goods or not, we cannot possess them at all." Quote, "The virtues are those qualities which enable the evils to be overcome, the task to be accomplished, the journey to be completed." The virtues, the unity of a human life, and the concept of a tradition. Chapters 15 and 16 form the constructive heart of MacIntyre's argument, where he moves from historical reconstruction to positive philosophical proposal. Chapter 15 begins by identifying 2 kinds of obstacle to envisaging each human life as a whole, as a unity whose character provides the virtues with an adequate telos. The social obstacles derive from modernity's partition of each human life into a variety of segments. Work divided from leisure, private life from public, the corporate from the personal, childhood and old age wrenched away from the rest of human life and made over into distinct realms, so that it is the distinctiveness of each and not the unity of the life of the individual who passes through those parts in terms of which we're taught to think and to feel. The philosophical obstacles derive from 2 tendencies: analytical philosophy, which thinks atomistically about human action and analyzes complex actions in terms of simple components, and sociological theory and existentialism, which separate the individual from the roles he or she plays. Narrative unity and the self. The self, in the Aristotelian tradition MacIntyre, is recovering, is a self whose unity resides in the unity of a narrative which links birth to life to death as narrative beginning to middle to end. The Sartrean self, which refuses the inauthenticity of conventionalized social relationships, loses that arena of social relationships in which the Aristotelian virtues function, if they function at all. The Goffmanesque self, liquidated into a set of demarcated areas of role-playing, allows no scope for the exercise of dispositions which could genuinely be accounted virtues in any sense remotely Aristotelian. Were spoken of as the virtues of a good committee man or gambler are professional skills, not virtues. Someone who genuinely possesses a virtue can be expected to manifest it in very different types of situation. Hector exhibited one and the same courage in parting from Andromache and on the battlefield with Achilles. Eleanor Marx exhibited one and the same compassion toward her father and in her entanglement with Aveling. The unity of a virtue in someone's life is intelligible only as a characteristic of a unitary life, and each stage in the emergence of modern conceptions of moral judgment was accompanied by a corresponding stage in the emergence of modern conceptions of selfhood. MacIntyre develops this through an analysis of action. One and the same segment of behavior may be correctly characterized as digging, gardening, taking exercise, preparing for winter, or pleasing his wife, but which characterization is primary depends on narrative context. If the agent's primary intention is to put the garden in order before winter, we have one type of behavior to explain. If it is to please his wife by taking exercise, we have another. We cannot characterize behavior or intentions independently of the settings, institutions, practices, milieu, that make intentions intelligible, and every setting has a history within which individual histories must be situated. Human conversation itself has a narrative structure. To understand what someone is doing in asking a question, we must know the story up to that point. And the reply is an episode in a conversation that is itself enacted narrative. The storytelling animal. This leads to the central thesis. Man is in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. Against Louis Mink and Sartre's Roquin, MacIntyre insists that narrative is not imposed retrospectively upon life from outside. Hopes are characterized as unfulfilled in battles as decisive in life as in art, and final partings take place in life as well as in stories. But have you never heard of death? Human lives have beginnings, middles, and endings. Genres, hagiography, saga, tragedy can be more or less adequate to the same life, as with Thomas Becket. And one narrative may be embedded in another, as Beckett's career is embedded in the reign of Henry II. We are never more than co-authors of our own narratives. We enter upon a stage we did not design, playing subordinate parts in others' dramas while remaining heroes of our own. Lives combine unpredictability with teleology. We live toward futures that present themselves as teloi, yet we do not know what will happen next. We enter human society with one or more imputed characters, roles into which we have been drafted, and we have to learn what they are in order to understand how others respond to us and how our responses to them are apt to be construed. It is through hearing stories about wicked stepmothers, lost children, good but misguided kings, wolves that suckle twin boys, youngest sons who receive no inheritance but must make their own way in the world, and eldest sons who waste their inheritance on riotous living and go into exile to live with the swine, that children learn or mislearn both what a child and what a parent is. Deprive children of stories, and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words. The question, "What am I to do?" can be answered only if one can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part. Personal identity, tradition, and the quest. The narrative concept of selfhood requires that I am what I may justifiably be taken by others to be in the course of living out a story that runs from my birth to my death. Against Locke, Hume, and Parfit, MacIntyre argues that personal identity cannot be founded on psychological continuity alone. The self inhabits a character whose unity is given as the unity of a character, and I am forever answerable for what I have been at any time for others. When someone complains that life is meaningless, the complaint is often that the narrative has become unintelligible, that it lacks point or movement toward a climax or telos. MacIntyre offers a second definition of virtue, a quality that enables me to be good in the way of life in which I am living, reinterpreting the goods of practices within the unity of a single life. The argument extends to tradition. A living tradition is an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition. Traditions are not what Burke thought. They are not opposed to reason, but are the context within which all reasoning takes place. When a tradition becomes Burkean, it is always dying or dead. A living tradition embodies continuities of conflict. When an institution bears a tradition of practice, its common life is partly constituted by continuous argument as to what a university is and ought to be, or what good medicine is. What sustains traditions is the exercise of the virtues, and what corrupts them is their lack, including the virtue of having an adequate sense of the traditions to which one belongs, which manifests itself in a grasp of future possibilities the past has made available. Cardinal Pole possessed this capacity. Mary Tudor did not. The chapter culminates in the idea of the quest. The good life for man is the life spent in seeking for the good life for man, and the virtues necessary for the seeking are those which will enable us to understand what more and what else the good life for man is. This is not a search for something already adequately characterized as miners' search for gold. It is a quest in which the goal is finally to be understood through encountering harms, dangers, temptations, and distractions. A quest is always an education, both as to the character of that which is sought and in self-knowledge. MacIntyre offers a third definition of virtue accordingly, a quality that sustains me in the pursuit of the good life as a whole. Tragic dilemmas differ from modern disagreements between incommensurable premises. Both alternatives lead to authentic goods, and by choosing one, I do nothing to diminish the claim of the other. The tragic protagonist cannot do everything he or she ought to do. This ought, unlike Kant's, does not imply can. Yet the moral task may still be performed better or worse, heroically or unheroically, generously or ungenerously, and assertions about what would be better for X depend upon the intelligible narrative that provides X's life with its unity. The lack of any such unifying conception underlies modern denials that moral judgments ascribing virtues or vices state facts. Narrative selfhood. The unity of a human life is the unity of an enacted story linking birth to death. Virtues require such unity, not mere role performance or atomic actions. Traditions as living arguments. A tradition is an historically extended debate about the goods that constitute it, sustained by justice, courage, truthfulness, and practical judgment. The quest. The good life is the life spent seeking the good life, a teleological journey whose end is understood only through the journey itself. Quote, "Man is in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. He is not essentially, but becomes through his history, a teller of stories that aspire to truth." Quote, "A living tradition, then, is an historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition." Quote, "The good life for man is the life spent in seeking for the good life for man, and the virtues necessary for the seeking are those which will enable us to understand what more and what else the good life for man is." From the virtues to virtue and after virtue. Chapter 16 traces how the concept of a virtue itself was transformed once the background notions of narrative unity and of a practice with goods internal to it were displaced from the center of modern culture. Contemporary moral debate remains interminable in part because heterogeneous and incommensurable concepts, utility, rights, and various surviving virtue concepts, jostle together without clear consensus on the place of virtue relative to other moral notions or on which dispositions belong in the catalog. Versions of the traditional scheme survive within particular subcultures, but when their representatives enter public debate, they are easily interpreted and misinterpreted in terms of the pluralism that threatens to submerge us all. Literary historians from Auerbach to John Gardner have traced how narrative was relegated to a separate realm of art, exempted from moral tasks, so that thinkers from Sartre to William Gass treat narrative as segregating storytelling from life rather than connecting them. Yet narrative understanding cannot be finally expelled without expelling life itself. It recurs in 19th century novels, 20th century movies, and the half-suppressed plot lines of each morning's newspaper. Work, practices, and the marginalization of virtue. The concept of a practice has been similarly removed to the margins. When production moved outside the household and was put to the service of impersonal capital, work tended to become separated from everything but biological survival and institutionalized acquisitiveness on the one hand. Pleonexia, a vice for Aristotle, now the driving force of modern productive work, and from the realm of practices with internal goods on the other. Politics, as Aristotle conceived it, is a practice. Politics, as James Mill conceived it, is not. Arts, sciences, and games become work only for a minority of specialists. For the rest, aesthetic consumption replaces engagement in practice. The historical processes by which the aesthete and the bureaucratic manager became central characters of modern society and by which narrative unity and practice were expelled to the margins turn out to be one and the same. Withdraw those background concepts from the areas where human life is mostly lived and what remains for the virtues to become: passions, utility, and the thinning of virtue. The explicit rejection of Aristotelianism at the level of philosophy made a traditional account of the virtues impossible by the end of the 17th century, yet praise and practice of the virtues still pervaded social life in highly traditional ways. creating new problems for anyone seeking systematic justification. One new option was to understand virtues as expressions of natural passions, or as dispositions necessary to curb destructive passions. The framework in which morality came to be equated with altruism and human beings were thought dangerously egoistic by nature. On the Aristotelian view, my good as a man is one with the good of those with whom I am bound in community. Goods are not private property, and the egoist has made a fundamental mistake. Once that mistake is generalized, altruism becomes socially necessary, yet apparently impossible. Hume's treatment exemplifies the transformation. Without a shared conception of the community's good, desert, and honor detached from their original contexts, distributive justice can no longer be defined by desert, and chastity in women is connected with securing property for legitimate heirs. Utility becomes the hallmark of virtue for Hume and Franklin, infecting conceptions of benevolence with a license for manipulative intervention. Virtues are reconceived not as distinct from rules, but as dispositions necessary to produce obedience to moral rules, a tendency reaching from Hume through Kant and Mill to Rawls, who defines virtues as sentiments regulated by a desire to act from moral principles while divorcing commitment from any substantial belief in the good for man. Linguistically, moral virtue ceases to be a tautology, and virtue tends toward the singular. Where the tradition spoke of the virtues, modernity increasingly speaks of virtue as compliance with a single standard. When teleology is abandoned, Stoicism tends to substitute for it. Virtue becomes its own end, reward, and motive. Nature replaces God as legislator for Diderot and others. Johnson's patience, unlike the medieval virtue bound to hope, becomes preparedness to live without hope in this world. Adam Smith divides virtues into prudence, justice, and benevolence, rule-following dispositions requiring the Stoic virtue of self-command to control distracting passions, while tombstone inscriptions across England display rival and incompatible catalogues, Humean praise of useful and amiable qualities, Christian lists of faith, hope, and charity, inscriptions that must praise more than morality alone. Republicanism represents a partial restoration of the classical tradition, a public good prior to the summing of individual interests, but enters modernity without Aristotelian natural science or the patronage of absolute despotisms. Jane Austen and the restricted space of virtue. Jane Austen is, with Cobbett and the Jacobins, the last great representative of the classical tradition. She unites Christian and Aristotelian themes in determinate social contexts, restoring teleology while the restricted households of Highbury and Mansfield Park serve as surrogates for the Greek city-state and the medieval kingdom. She is preoccupied, as her moral climate requires, with counterfeits of the virtues. Morality is never mere inhibition of the passions, as Marion Dashwood discovers, but the outward appearance of morality may disguise uneducated passions, and Henry Crawford's elegance, charm, and skill at playing parts make him the dissimulator par excellence, treating the clerical role as mere appearance. Constancy, the virtue of reasserting narrative unity in deed rather than word, responds to the peculiarly modern threat of a life dissolved into disconnected episodes. It is reinforced by patience and courage, but identical with neither. Through Fanny Price's refusal of Henry Crawford, placing the danger of losing her soul before gaining a world, Austen rejects Humean and Franklinian catalogues in favor of virtue pursued for a certain kind of happiness, not utility. Recognition scenes in Pride and Prejudice and Emma embody the Christian self-knowledge that repentance requires. Till this moment, I never knew myself. The form of Austen's ironic comedy coincides with her moral point of view. Characters and readers see more than they intended and correct themselves, as the virtues and the harms they alone overcome provide structure for both a life in which telos can be achieved and a narrative in which such a life can be unfolded. Any specific account of the virtues presupposes an equally specific account of the narrative structure and unity of a human life, and vice versa. After Austen, the life of the virtues is afforded a very restricted cultural space. In most of public and private life, the classical virtues are replaced by meager modern substitutes. Henry James inherits something of her insight, but in a world where moral substance grows increasingly elusive, a development whose public consequences depend above all on what happened to the conception of justice as a virtue. Thinning of virtue. Once narrative unity and practice were marginalized, virtues were redefined through passions, utility, and rule obedience, and virtue tended towards singularity. Hume and the passions, without shared telos, desert and honor detached from community. Utility and legal entitlement replace Aristotelian justice. Constancy. Jane Austen's response to modern fragmentation, reasserting the narrative unity of a life when that unity can no longer be taken for granted. Quote, Pleonexia, a vice in the Aristotelian scheme, is now the driving force of modern productive work. Quote, where once the common language of morality, even in everyday speech, had embodied a set of precise distinctions which presupposed a complex moral scheme, there comes into being a kind of linguistic melange which enables very little to be said. Quote, Jane Austen is the last great, effective, imaginative voice of the tradition of thought about and practice of the virtues which I have tried to identify. Justice as a virtue. Changing conceptions. When Aristotle praised justice as the first virtue of political life, he did so in such a way as to suggest that a community which lacks practical agreement on a conception of justice must also lack the necessary basis for political community. Chapter 17 traces what has happened to justice since Aristotle, showing how the modern world has inherited a concept it can no longer use coherently. The modern condition is that there are competing conceptions of justice, Rawls's and Nozick's being the most philosophically sophisticated, which invoke considerations that are rationally incommensurable with each other. How can a claim that gives priority to equality of needs be rationally weighed against one which gives priority to entitlements? The answer, for MacIntyre, is that it cannot, and this is not a defect of the arguments, but a symptom of the deeper disorder in modern moral thought. MacIntyre constructs a vivid dramatization of this incompatibility through two ideal typical characters. Character A, who may own a store or be a construction worker, struggles to save enough from his earnings to buy a house and send his children to college. He now finds all his projects threatened by rising taxes and regards this as unjust. Character B, who may be a social worker or someone with inherited wealth, is impressed with the arbitrariness of inequalities and believes that redistributive taxation is what justice demands. Both invoke justice, but their conceptions are not merely incompatible in practice. They are grounded in different and incommensurable conceptual frameworks. Rawls's account of justice as fairness articulates key elements of B's position. Nozick's account of justice as entitlement articulates key elements of A's. What neither Rawls nor Nozick captures is the concept of desert, the sense, present in ordinary moral discourse, that one deserves what one has earned, and that the poverty of the deprived is undeserved and therefore unwarranted. Rawls concedes that common sense connects justice with desert, but argues that we cannot know what anyone deserves until we have already formulated the rules of justice, and that under those rules it is legitimate expectations, not desert, that are in question. Nozick's scheme of justice based exclusively on entitlements can allow no place for desert at all. His tentative remarks on rectification afford no guidance for amending his general viewpoint. Both philosophers picture society as composed of individuals with prior interests who must formulate common rules, as though we had been shipwrecked among strangers, each pursuing private ends under minimal constraints. From such a standpoint, the notion of desert, which belongs only where a community's primary bond is a shared understanding of the human good, cannot find application. Nozick's tracing of legitimate entitlements to acts of original acquisition ideologically conceals how modern property derives from theft and violence. The lack of any adequate principle of rectification tends to vitiate his theory as a whole. Both A and B differ from Rawls and Nozick at the price of inconsistency. Each of them, in conjoining either Rawls's principles or Nozick's with an appeal to desert, exhibits an adherence to an older, more traditional, more Aristotelian and Christian view of justice. This inconsistency is thus a tribute to the residual power and influence of the tradition, a tradition that survives not only in philosophical fragments, but in the lives of certain communities whose historical ties with their past remain strong. The older moral tradition is discernible in the United States and elsewhere among, for example, some Catholic Irish, some Orthodox Greeks, and some Jews of an Orthodox persuasion, all of them communities that inherit their moral tradition not only through their religion, but also from the structure of the peasant villages and households which their immediate ancestors inhabited on the margins of modern Europe. Even in such communities, however, the need to enter public debate enforces participation in the cultural melange in search of a common stock of concepts, an allegiance constantly eroded in pursuit of what, if MacIntyre is correct, is a chimera. MacIntyre agrees with Marx, for quite non-Marxist reasons, that appeals to justice in modern politics are often futile. Rival conceptions of justice are formed by and inform the life of rival groups. Marx was mistaken in treating such disagreements as merely secondary reflections of class interest. Conceptions of justice are partly constitutive of social groups, and economic interests are often defined in terms of them. But he was fundamentally right that conflict, not consensus, lies at the heart of modern social structure. Moral philosophy, dominantly understood, reflects these debates so faithfully that its controversies prove unsettlable in just the way the political debates themselves are. The chapter concludes with a striking analysis of what follows for constitutional theory and political life. Liberal writers such as Ronald Dworkin invite us to see the Supreme Court as invoking consistent moral principles by which particular laws and decisions are to be evaluated. Modern politics, MacIntyre argues, is civil war carried on by other means. The Supreme Court in cases like Bakke does not invoke shared moral first principles. Our society as a whole has none, but plays the role of a peacemaking or truce-keeping body by negotiating its way through an impasse of conflict, forbidding precise ethnic quotas while allowing discrimination in favor of previously deprived minorities. To seek a consistent set of principles behind such a decision is to miss the point. Adam Ferguson had already seen that laws are expedients of policy to adjust the pretensions of parties and secure the peace of society, not lessons of morality. What our laws show is the extent to which conflict has to be suppressed. Modern systematic politics, whether liberal, conservative, radical, or socialist, simply has to be rejected from a standpoint that owes genuine allegiance to the tradition of the virtues. For modern politics itself expresses, in its institutional forms, a systematic rejection of that tradition. Even patriotism, which requires attachment to a political and moral community, becomes systematically unclear when government does not express the moral community of citizens, but imposes bureaucratized unity on a society lacking genuine moral consensus. Loyalty to one's community remains a central virtue, but becomes detached from obedience to whichever government happens to rule, a distancing that must not be confused with either liberal hostility to particularity or anarchist rejection of government as such. Incommensurable justice. Modern rival conceptions of justice, entitlement versus need, are not merely competing principles, but are grounded in different and rationally incommensurable conceptual frameworks. The residual tradition. The concept of desert, which belongs to the classical tradition, persists in ordinary moral discourse as a living residue that neither Rawls nor Nozick can accommodate. Politics as civil war. Modern politics, lacking genuine moral consensus, is civil war carried on by other means. The Supreme Court functions not as a moral authority, but as a truce-keeping body. Quote, modern systematic politics, whether liberal, conservative, radical, or socialist, simply has to be rejected from a standpoint that owes genuine allegiance to the tradition of the virtues. For modern politics itself expresses in its institutional forms a systematic rejection of that tradition. Quote, modern politics is civil war carried on by other means, and Baki was an engagement whose antecedents were at Gettysburg and Shiloh. Quote, "It is the reference to desert which makes them feel strongly that what they are complaining about is injustice, rather than some other kind of wrong or harm." After virtue, Nietzsche or Aristotle, Trotsky, and Saint Benedict. Chapter 18, the final philosophical chapter, takes its title from the books. MacIntyre surveys the options available to someone who has been convinced by his argument. He returns to the star question posed in Chapter 9, Nietzsche or Aristotle. The argument that led to posing that question had two central premises: that the language of morality today is in a state of grave disorder arising from the prevailing cultural power of an idiom in which ill-assorted conceptual fragments from various parts of our past are deployed together, and that ever since belief in Aristotelian teleology was discredited, moral philosophers have attempted to provide alternative rational secular accounts of morality, but all these attempts have failed. Nietzsche's negative proposal to raise to the ground the structures of inherited moral belief and argument had, whether we have regard to everyday moral belief and argument or look instead to the constructions of moral philosophers, and in spite of its desperate and grandiose quality, a certain plausibility. Unless, of course, the initial rejection of the moral tradition to which Aristotle's teaching about the virtues is central turned out to have been misconceived and mistaken. MacIntyre argues that Nietzsche's rejection is completely unsuccessful against the Aristotelian tradition. The Nietzschean polemic succeeds if all those whom he takes on as antagonists fail, but the Aristotelian tradition has not failed. The cogency of the Nietzschean rejection and refutation of modern moralities of rules, whether of a utilitarian or of a canon kind, did not necessarily extend to the earlier Aristotelian tradition. The key insight is that Nietzschean man, the Übermensch, the man who transcends, is wanting in respect of both relationships and activities. Nietzsche's portrait of the great man reveals someone who cannot enter into relationships mediated by appeal to shared standards or virtues or goods. He is his own only authority, and his relationships to others have to be exercises of that authority. But if the conception of a good has to be expounded in terms of practices, the narrative unity of a human life and moral tradition, then goods can only be discovered by entering into those relationships which constitute communities whose central bond is a shared vision of an understanding of goods. The isolation and self-absorption of the great man thrusts upon him the burden of being his own self-sufficient moral authority. And this is not greatness, but moral solipsism. This leaves two models for responding to the crisis of modernity: Trotsky and Saint Benedict. Trotsky, the revolutionary who proposes to rebuild society from the ground up, represents the political radical's answer. But Trotsky's project fails because it requires precisely the kind of total, secular, and rational vindication that the argument of after virtue has shown to be impossible. Saint Benedict, the monk who founded a monastery to preserve the moral and intellectual tradition against the collapse of Roman civilization, represents a different answer. A crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of good will turn aside from the task of shoring up the Roman Imperium and cease to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that imperium. What they set themselves to achieve instead, often not recognizing fully what they were doing, was the construction of new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. MacIntyre's conclusion is both famous and frequently quoted. What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civilization and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. The Dark Age is not merely metaphorical. It names the condition of a society that has lost its shared moral framework and must construct new forms of community in order to survive. The barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They have already been governing us for quite some time. And yet the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages. So, we are not entirely without grounds for hope. We are waiting not for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict. Nietzsche's failure. The Nietzschean Übermensch, by cutting himself off from shared practices and communities, condemns himself to moral solipsism rather than achieving authentic transcendence. The Benedictine option, the model of Saint Benedict, preserving moral tradition through the construction of local communities, is the only adequate response to the crisis of modernity. The New Dark Ages. Modern society has already entered a new dark age. The barbarians are not beyond the frontiers, but within them. Quote, "What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civilization and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us." Quote, Nietzschean man, the Übermensch, the man who transcends, finds his good nowhere in the social world to date, but only in that in himself which dictates his own new law and his own new table of the virtues. Why does he never find any objective good with authority over him in the social world to date? The answer is not difficult. Nietzsche's portrait makes it clear that he who transcends is wanting in respect of both relationships and activities. Quote, "We are waiting not for a Godot, but for another, doubtless very different, Saint Benedict." Postscript to the second edition. The postscript to the second edition, added in 1987, records MacIntyre's own intellectual development since the book's first publication. The numerous critics of the first edition put MacIntyre greatly in their debt. Some identified blunders, from confusions over names to a factual error about Giotto. Some pointed out inadequacies in the historical narrative, and some disputed the diagnosis of modern society itself. Responding to these criticisms required long-term projects directed toward the varying disciplinary concerns of MacIntyre's critics. For After Virtue had deliberately violated conventional academic boundaries in order to set out a single complex thesis about the place of the virtues in human life. The postscript addresses three areas where restatement is most urgent. The first concerns the relationship of philosophy to history. William Frankena spoke for academic orthodoxy when he insisted that philosophy and history are distinct disciplines and that a historical inquiry cannot establish a philosophical point. Against this view, MacIntyre maintains that although arguments of the kind favored by analytic philosophy possess an indispensable power, it is only within the context of a particular genre of historical inquiry that such arguments can support the type of claim about truth and rationality which philosophers characteristically aspire to justify. The subject matters of moral philosophy, evaluative and normative concepts, maxims, arguments, and judgments, are nowhere to be found except as embodied in the historical lives of particular social groups. Morality, which is no particular society's morality, is to be found nowhere. There was the morality of 4th century Athens. There were the moralities of 13th century Western Europe. There are numerous such moralities, but wherever was or is morality as such? Both Frankena's analytic moral philosophy and MacIntyre's historicism are, in key part, responses to the failure of Kant's transcendental answer to that question. What Kant presented as the universal and necessary principles of the human mind turned out, Hegel and subsequent historicists argued, to be principles specific to particular times and places. What Kant took to be the principles of morality as such were in fact those of a secularized Protestantism furnishing modern liberal individualism with one of its founding charters. A second line of objection undermined Kant's conceptions of necessity and the a priori. The history of analytic philosophy, chronicled by Richard Rorty among others, has succeeded in establishing that there are no grounds for belief in universal necessary principles, outside purely formal inquiries, except relative to some set of assumptions. Analytic philosophy has thus become, in David Lewis's phrase, a matter of bringing opinions and theories into equilibrium. It can occasionally show that a position involves too much incoherence for any reasonable person to hold it. But it can never establish the rational acceptability of any particular positive moral position when each rival has sufficient scope and its adherents are willing to pay the price of coherence. What this outcome suggests to the historicist is that arguments must be understood in the social and historical context for which they derive their import. Newtonian physics was rationally superior to its Galilean, Aristotelian, and Cartesian rivals only in virtue of its historical relationship to them. It solved problems in areas where those rivals could make no progress by their own standards. Abstract Newtonian physics from its context and incommensurability problems arise. The philosophy of physical science is dependent on the history of physical science, and the case is no different with morality. Moral philosophies are the explicit articulations of the claims of particular moralities to rational allegiance. The history of morality and the history of moral philosophy are a single history. Rival moralities make competing claims, and these claims are to be judged, as in natural science, by whether one moral philosophy amidst a particular morality can transcend the limitations of its rivals by the rational standards to which the protagonists of those rivals are already committed. A rejoinder holds that the chronicler of such a history must bring standards of rational superiority that themselves require non-historical justification. MacIntyre replies that our situation regarding theories about what makes one theory rationally superior to another is no different from our situation regarding scientific or moral theories. We aspire not to a perfect theory invulnerable to all objections, but to the best theory so far in the history of this class of theories. This historicism, unlike Hegel's, involves fallibilism and excludes all claims to absolute knowledge. Yet if a particular moral scheme has successfully transcended the limitations of its predecessors, confronted successive challenges, and modified itself to incorporate the strengths of rival points of view while avoiding their weaknesses, then we have the best possible reason to have confidence that future challenges will also be met. And just this is the achievement MacIntyre ascribes to Aristotle's fundamental moral scheme. What he claimed about the Enlightenment project was not merely that it failed by its own standards, but that the grounds for understanding those failures could only be provided out of the resources afforded by an Aristotelian account of the virtues, though he did not claim in after virtue to have as yet fully sustained that claim. Annette Bayer and Honora O'Neill have since shown that the accounts of practical reasoning advanced by Hume and Kant present the central challenge still to be met. Frankina saw MacIntyre as an inadequate analytic philosopher with an irrelevant interest in history. Abraham et al. Saw him as an inadequate social historian who needlessly dragged in analytic philosophy, mirror-image criticisms that identify issues to which MacIntyre had paid insufficient attention. A good deal of social and institutional history essential to the narrative of After Virtue remained to be written. The second area concerns the virtues and the issue of relativism. Samuel Scheffler, Stanley Hauerwas, Paul Waddell, and Robert Wachbroit raised doubts about MacIntyre's three-stage account. Virtues as qualities necessary to achieve the goods internal to practices, as qualities contributing to the good of a whole life, and as related to the pursuit of a good elaborated only within an ongoing social tradition. MacIntyre begins from practices because they are ongoing modes of activity within which ends must be discovered and rediscovered, generating new conceptions of excellence, a framework obscured by the means-ends distinction governing much modern moral philosophy. The virtues are not related to internal goods as skills are related to their ends. Kant was right that moral imperatives are neither imperatives of skill nor of prudence, but wrong to suppose that the only alternative is the categorical imperative. Scheffler wondered whether a great but vicious chess player could achieve internal goods of chess. MacIntyre's answer is that such a player cares only about winning and its contingent rewards, goods not specific to chess at all, and therefore does not achieve the excellence specific to the practice, which far less skilled players may attain at their own level. No human quality counts as a virtue unless it satisfies the conditions at all three stages. Ruthlessness may serve wilderness exploration, but fails when transposed into family life, and qualities that survive the second stage may still fail the third. Wachbroit argued that MacIntyre's account is compatible with rival, incompatible traditions of the virtues, and then posed a dilemma. Either appeal to principles independent of all traditions, or accept that moral rationality is internal to and relative to some particular tradition with no reason to prefer one over another. MacIntyre denies the exhaustiveness of this disjunction. Rival traditions that recognize each other as advancing contentions on issues of importance must share some common features. Adherents of each may discover, by their own standards, that a rival tradition offers cogent explanations of weaknesses their own resources could not address. Traditions do on occasion founder. An encounter with a rival may provide good reasons for radical reconstitution or desertion. Yet if a tradition has repeatedly succeeded in reconstituting itself, when rational considerations required, its adherents are rationally entitled to confidence in its resources, and nothing could guarantee in advance that such a situation could not arise except a resuscitation of the Kantian transcendental project. The third area concerns the relationship of moral philosophy to theology. Geoffrey Stout identified a serious gap. From the moment biblical religion and Aristotelianism encountered one another, the relationship of claims about the human virtues to claims about divine law required an answer. Any reconciliation would have to defend the thesis that only a life constituted in key part by obedience to law could exhibit fully those virtues without which human beings cannot achieve their telos. Any justified rejection would have to give reasons for denying that thesis. The classic statement is Aquinas's. The most cogent case against it is Harry Jaffe's Thomism and Aristotelianism. By avoiding the issues Aquinas' combination of theological allegiance to the Torah and philosophical allegiance to Aristotle raises, MacIntyre obscured the complex Protestant and Jansenist reactions to the Aristotelian tradition and Kant's later attempt to establish a secular morality of law that identified Aristotelianism as a prime source of moral error. After Virtue ought therefore to be read as a work still in progress, one whose central conclusions require addition and emendation that MacIntyre hoped to supply in the sequel on justice and practical reasoning, and in the generous critical interchanges his critics had made possible. Historicism and fallibilism. Rational superiority in morality, as in science, is established only historically and always fallibly. There are no timeless neutral standards, only the best theory so far. Three-stage virtues. A quality counts as a virtue only if it satisfies conditions at all three stages: practices, whole lives, and traditions, not merely the first. The theology gap. The narrative of After Virtue inadequately treats the encounter between biblical religion and Aristotelian virtue ethics, a deficiency MacIntyre acknowledged and hoped to remedy. Quote, "Morality, which is no particular society's morality, is to be found nowhere. There was the morality of 4th century Athens. There were the moralities of 13th century Western Europe. There are numerous such moralities, but where ever was or is morality as such?" Postscript, quote, "It is only because human beings have an end towards which they are directed by reason of their specific nature that practices, traditions, and the like are able to function as they do." Postscript, citing prologue, quote, "After Virtue, in this respect as in others, ought to be read as a work still in progress." Postscript. Conclusion. After Virtue is a book that changes the way you see moral language. Its central argument, that modern moral discourse is in a state of disorder because the Enlightenment project of justifying morality by reason alone was bound to fail, is a thesis that has become a commonplace of philosophical discussion, yet retains its force. What makes the book enduring is not merely the diagnosis, but the architecture of the recovery. MacIntyre demonstrates that the disorder has a specific historical origin, a catastrophe, the Enlightenment's failed attempt to ground morality in pure reason, a period of fragmentation, the proliferation of rival, incommensurable moral vocabularies, and a restoration in which the fragments were reassembled without their original context. He then traces the virtues from their expression in heroic societies, where morality and social structure were one, through the incoherence of Athenian moral discourse, the teleological framework of Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, the complex balance of the medieval world, and the weakening and fragmentation of the tradition in modernity. The positive proposal, the Aristotelian tradition reconstituted within a narrative understanding of human life, community, and the virtues as qualities that sustain practices, personal identity, and historical traditions, remains one of the most formidable alternatives to emotivism and Nietzschean individualism. MacIntyre's account of justice as a virtue rather than a distributive principle, his analysis of modern politics as civil war carried on by other means, and his call to construct local forms of community within which the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages, are not relics of a Cold War debate, but descriptions of a condition that has only deepened since the book's first publication. The book does not offer easy answers, but it offers something more valuable, a way of thinking about morality that takes seriously both the historical depth of the tradition and the urgency of the contemporary crisis. The new dark ages that MacIntyre diagnoses are not a metaphor for some distant future, but a description of the present condition of moral culture, and the construction of local forms of community within which the virtues can be sustained is, for MacIntyre, the only adequate response. Key persons discussed. Alasdair MacIntyre, born in 1929, Scottish-American philosopher, author of After Virtue, Whose Justice? Which Rationality? And Dependent Rational Animals. His work integrates virtue ethics, communitarianism, and a historical understanding of moral traditions. Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC Greek philosopher, author of the Nicomachean Ethics and Politics. His account of the virtues as qualities that enable a person to achieve the good life within a community is the central focus of MacIntyre's positive project. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274 Italian theologian and philosopher, author of the Summa Theologiae. MacIntyre argues that Aquinas was in some respects a better Aristotelian than Aristotle, providing the metaphysical grounding that Aristotle U2019's on account lacked. G. Moore, 1873 to 1958 English philosopher, author of Principia Ethica. His intuitionist account of good as a simple, indefinable, non-natural property was a catalyst for the emotivist reaction. C. L. Stevenson, 1908 to 1979 American philosopher, leading exponent of emotivism. His Ethics and Language, 1944, argued that moral judgments are expressions of attitude or feeling. David Hume, 1711 to 1776 Scottish philosopher, author of a treatise of human nature and inquiry concerning the principles of morals. His argument that morality is the work of the passions rather than reason was a crucial step in the Enlightenment project's failure. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804 German philosopher, author of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals and the critique of practical reason. His attempt to ground morality in reason alone was one of the three great rivals of the Enlightenment project. Søren Kierkegaard, 1813 to 1855 Danish philosopher, author of Fear and Trembling and Either/or. His account of criterionless fundamental choice was the third rival of the Enlightenment project. John Rawls, 1921 to 2002 American political philosopher, author of A Theory of Justice, 1971. His account of justice as fairness is one of the two modern theories that MacIntyre examines in Chapter 17. Robert Nozick, 1938 to 2002 American political philosopher, author of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, 1974. His account of justice as entitlement is the other of the two modern theories MacIntyre examines. Sophocles, c. 496 to 406 BC Greek playwright, author of the Philoctetes and Antigone. His tragedies portray the incoherence of moral standards in 5th century Athens. Plato, c. 427 to 347 BC Greek philosopher, author of the Republic and Nicomachean Ethics, attributed to Aristotle. His attempt to produce a coherent account of the virtues is a crucial step in the classical tradition. Jane Austen, 1775 to 1817 English novelist, author of Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, and Persuasion. MacIntyre identifies her as the last great effective imaginative voice of the classical tradition of the virtues, uniting Christian and Aristotelian themes and introducing the virtue of constancy. Key works discussed. After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre, 1981 The book under analysis. arguing that modern moral discourse is in disorder because of the failure of the Enlightenment project. Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle, c. 340 BC. Aristotle's account of the virtues, the good life, and the role of practical wisdom, Phronesis. Politics, Aristotle, c. 350 BC. Aristotle's account of the polis as the community in which the virtues are exercised. Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas, 1265 to 1274. Aquinas U 2019's masterwork, which MacIntyre regards as providing the metaphysical grounding for Aristotle's moral philosophy. Aquinas was a better Aristotelian than Aristotle. Principia Ethica, G. Moore, 1903. Moore's account of good as a simple, indefinable, non-natural property. Ethics and Language, C. L. Stevenson, 1944. Stevenson's account of emotivism as a theory about the meaning of moral language. A Treatise of Human Nature, David Hume, 1739. Hume's argument that morality is the work of the passions rather than reason. Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, Immanuel Kant, 1785. Kant's attempt to ground morality in reason alone. Or Soren Kierkegaard, 1843. Kierkegaard's account of criterionless fundamental choice. A Theory of Justice, John Rawls, 1971. Rawls's account of justice as fairness, arguing for equality of needs. Anarchy, State, and Utopia, Robert Nozick, 1974. Nozick's account of justice as entitlement. The Iliad, Homer, c. 8th century BC. The epic poem that portrays heroic society and the virtues as they were understood in the Homeric world. Persuasion, Jane Austen, 1817. Austen's final completed novel, which MacIntyre treats as the culmination of the classical tradition of the virtues. And Eliot embodies constancy as a central virtue. Index of Key Concepts. Emotivism, the doctrine that all evaluative judgments are expressions of preference, attitude, or feeling. MacIntyre argues that this describes the actual state of modern moral discourse. The Enlightenment project, the 18th century attempt to provide a rational, secular foundation for morality, which MacIntyre argues was bound to fail. The classical tradition, the tradition of moral thought that runs from Homer through Aristotle and the Middle Ages, in which the virtues are central and the good life is the life spent in seeking for the good life. The virtues, qualities of character that enable a person to achieve the good life within a community and a tradition. MacIntyre identifies 3 levels of the virtues: those that sustain practices, those that sustain a particular kind of life, and those that sustain a life as a whole. The good life, the life spent in seeking for the good life for man, and the virtues necessary for the seeking are those which will enable us to understand what more and what else the good life for man is. Practices, coherent and complex forms of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to, and partially definitive of, that form of activity. Tradition, a historically extended, socially embodied argument about the goods which constitute that tradition. Internal goods, goods that are internal to a practice, such as the achievement of excellence in a craft or a sport, and that are achieved only through the practice itself. External goods, goods that are external to a practice, such as prestige, status, power, and money, and that are by their nature competitive. Phronesis, practical wisdom, the virtue that enables a person to discern the right action in particular circumstances. Eudaimonia, the condition of living well and doing well, which MacIntyre interprets as a life spent in seeking for the good life. The emotivist self, the modern self, stripped of its traditional social roles and teleological orientation, that expresses its preferences and attitudes as if they were objective moral judgments. Narrative selfhood, the self whose unity is given as the unity of a narrative which links birth to life, to death, as narrative beginning to middle to end. Man is in his actions and practice, as well as in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. Desert, the concept that one deserves what one has earned and that the poverty of the deprived is undeserved. MacIntyre argues that desert belongs to the classical tradition and its absence from modern theories of justice is itself a symptom of the disorder. Constancy, a virtue introduced by Jane Austen. The reassertion of a narrative unity of a human life in deed rather than in word, crucial in a modern social world that tends to dissolve the self into disconnected episodes. Tragic dilemma, a situation in which both alternative courses of action lead to some authentic and substantial good, so that whatever the agent does, something he or she ought to have done is left undone. Unlike modern moral dilemmas, the tragic ought does not imply can. Reading comprehension questions. What is MacIntyre's disquieting suggestion about the state of modern moral discourse, and why is the analogy to a catastrophe in the natural sciences so effective? How does MacIntyre argue that emotivism is both a philosophical thesis and a social diagnosis? What is the significance of the failure of the Enlightenment project of justifying morality by reason alone? How does MacIntyre's account of the virtues in heroic society differ from the modern conception of the virtues? What is the relationship between the virtues, practices, and traditions in MacIntyre's account? How does MacIntyre's account of the narrative unity of human life challenge modern conceptions of selfhood? What is the significance of MacIntyre's distinction between internal goods and external goods? How does MacIntyre argue that justice, in the classical tradition, is a virtue rather than a distributive principle? What is the significance of MacIntyre's famous analogy about the new Dark Ages? Why does MacIntyre argue that the Aristotelian tradition, rather than the Nietzschean, offers the only viable alternative to emotivism? How does MacIntyre's account of the narrative unity of human life bear on the concept of personal identity? What does it mean to say that the self inhabits a character whose unity is given as the unity of a character? What is MacIntyre's three-part definition of virtue? And how does the concept of practices ground the first level? How does MacIntyre distinguish between a living tradition and a dead one? What does it mean to say that when a tradition becomes Burkean, it is always dying or dead? What is the significance of the concept of desert in MacIntyre's analysis of justice? And why does it disappear from modern theories? Why does MacIntyre say that modern politics is civil war carried on by other means? What follows for constitutional theory? What is the significance of Jane Austen's role in the classical tradition of the virtues? What does constancy add to the catalog of virtues? What is the difference between a tragic dilemma and a modern disagreement between rival moral premises? Why does the tragic ought not imply can?